Hello and welcome to this free preview video for my Excel VBA course. If you want to learn how to create macros, to automate repetitive Excel tasks, or to extend Excel's functionality beyond writing formulas, then this is the course for you. My name is Alan Murray and I have taught thousands of students Excel online. My Excel VBA course will take you from a beginner to an advanced Excel VBA user. It contains over 11 hours of quality lessons, with additional lessons always being added to keep this course fresh and up to date. The exact files that I use on the course are available for you to download so that you can complete the projects along with me. And if you have any questions, I am always available online and will get back to you as soon as I can. Join the thousands of students who are already taking and enjoying this course. This course has hundreds of ratings and is currently on 4.4 stars out of a possible 5. The full course is normally £95, but you can get it for just £10, a ridiculous 89% discount, by redeeming coupon code YouTube10 or by using the link on this video. This free preview video contains over 3 hours of Excel VBA lessons. It begins by showing you how to record a macro to achieve a typical repetitive task, and then to make some basic edits to that macro code to take it that extra mile and give it extra functionality. We then start getting into writing VBA code from scratch, talking about the different elements of VBA and what you need to know, the fundamental skills. We look at solving errors, and then we start talking about using variables in Excel VBA. The full course also then takes you into making decisions, creating loops for repetitive tasks, error handling and debugging, interacting with users, working with directories, working with arrays, and much more. So that's enough from me. Let's get on with the free preview lessons, and I hope to see you in the full course very soon. Hello and welcome to the first tutorial of our Excel VBA course, where we begin our quest to gain Excel Jedi powers so that we can handle or manipulate almost any data within our Excel spreadsheet and handle any problem. Our first tutorial is going to be to look at recording macros. Now, those of you who have taken the Excel Superhero course, we would have covered recording macros there. Now, the examples used will be a little bit different, some of them, so it is completely up to you whether you skip this chapter and go straight into the VBA elements, or whether you sit through these as a kind of recap and a bit of a refresher and see some slightly different examples used. There will be some VBA elements covering in this section as well, but for the most part it will be looking at recording. And this is very important. We'll look at the differences as the course evolves, but recording a macro will never look beyond. It can be a very helpful tool no matter how far you get in VBA. It won't generate the best code and stuff, we'll look at that, or be that powerful, nowhere near. But it's an important element to help us learn, understand, get code to tweak, in much the same reason that you may spell check work or have a dictionary at home. Why do you? Do you not know that language? Of course you do. But, you forget how things are spelled, you look at words you're not familiar with, this kind of stuff. And in much the same way with recording, we can't write code for every single feature that Excel has. We don't even know them all. Nobody does. So it's an important step to start with. And as an example here, what we want to be able to do is on this worksheet on screen, I want to protect the formulas on it. Now this spreadsheet only has 3 cells with a formula in. So this may be a basic example. But I want this macro, a little clicky button on our toolbar. When I click it, I want it to be able to lock down the cells that have a formula on the spreadsheet. I don't want to have to be able to tell the macro. And so, look, they're in these 3 cells here, B10 to D10. I don't want to have to do that. Whatever's going on in that spreadsheet, I'll click a button. Excel will figure out where the formulas are, lock them down. That's what I want to happen. So before we get going with recording our macro, we're going to have a little rehearsal. We're going to plan and research our steps. And this will become, we'll recap on this as the course goes on. And into the VBA elements, it will be more important that, although it's not imperative, it's a good idea to plan our stuff before we look at recording it. We want to make sure we know what we're doing and the best way of doing it before we get going. I want to make sure it even works. So, my plan here is that we are going to select the square in the top left to select all the cells of the spreadsheet. I don't know whether these cells are locked or unlocked. I can't guarantee this because I don't know what other people are doing on this spreadsheet. I want to go into the Format Cells dialog box any way we're comfortable in doing so, to the Protection tab, so that with this locked box, I'm going to turn it on and turn it off to ensure that them cells are unlocked. So when I click OK, they're now unlocked. I get these little triangles warning me where the formulas are. Are you crazy? Why would you do that to formulas? I'm not going to. What I'm next going to do is I'm going to the Find and Select button on the Home tab, and sorry, I'm not going to go to Special. I'm going to Formulas. I'm going to select all the cells of this spreadsheet that have a formula in them. So when I click that, it selects the cells with a formula, selecting only them 3. That feature is a lot more powerful than it might initially look. The fact that Excel figures out where the formulas are and selects them. Very relative way of working, extremely powerful, very useful. I'm then going back into Format Cells, Protection tab, and locking them. 3 down, the warning disappears, and then I'm going to be going to Review and Protecting the sheet. And I won't worry about a password or any of these other features for now. It's just an example of recording a macro. Those of you who took the Excel Superhero course, we would have done worksheet protection on that. So the reasons why we're unlocking cells and locking cells and the features in here will be more, you'll understand things more. Or you may know it from outside doing that course. But now I've protected that sheet, that is done. Now I haven't recorded a macro yet, I've just kind of rehearsed what I want to do. Next step is, if I'm happy with doing that and it seemed to work okay, is to record it. So in the future I'll have a button that will run that macro and do that job. Because I don't know what that was, 8 clicks? I didn't really count as I was doing it. Nothing crazy, but certainly would be more helpful. So I'm going to backtrack my steps. I'm going to unprotect that. And I won't bother locking. It's irrelevant for the recording to work. I'm going to start recording the macro. To do this, I'm going to the View tab and the drop down arrow for the Macros button. Now I do have a Record Macro button actually in the bottom left of my screen down here, we can see. So I could go that way, I could go the Developer tab way. But I'm going to go this way as I'm here already and look at recording a macro. First thing it will ask is, what would you like to call the macro? I'm going to call it Protect Formulas. Let's try and spell that correctly. Protect Formulas. That sounds like a good name for me, that's what I'm doing. Now you're not allowed to use spaces in macro names, so I've got an underscore here to skip around that issue. Shortcut key. Would I like to use a shortcut key for this? Now personally no. I'm not a big fan of this feature. It's not to say it can't be useful, but personally not a fan of it. If I did choose Control P, it doesn't even warn me, but that will become the shortcut key for this macro, therefore replacing print in the scope of this macro. And if I chose R, I'll choose R then. Copying series to the right, or F, which is find. So, potentially dangerous. You cannot undo a macro. Your Control Z or your spinny blue arrow will be disabled after running a macro. You cannot undo it. Your saving grace, if this has made a mistake, is to close the spreadsheet down, saying no to saving changes. So potentially dangerous. This macro is quite harmless. People can just unprotect it if they know the password. But personally, not a big fan of the benefits. You might as well have a clicky button. It's not that important as to I've seen it do bad things in the past. Where do I want to store the macro? Now we're going to store it in this workbook, meaning this macro, the scope of the macro, it's only available when this workbook is open. So I can email this workbook to others and the macro will be travelled with it for distribution. But I have to have this file open. I have to have access to it and have it open. The personal macro workbook, the other useful setting in there, which we'll see at some point during this course, makes this macro global for you. So the word personal, it's available only to you. So in your login, your kind of roaming profile in a business scenario. And this macro is available in any file that you use. You don't have to have it open. It's a hidden file, this personal workbook. Sort of like a template. And it just sits behind the scenes, making these macros available to you at any file that you use. Not for others. So pros and cons to them two different settings. For now I'm going for this workbook. I won't worry with a description, but here, actually let's type one in. I'll just say that this macro protects cells containing formulas on the current sheet. There you go, that's what it does. And I'll click OK. So that's going to begin to record our macro. I can see in the bottom left hand corner of my screen that there's a blue square on the status bar. That's my stop button. We'll be pressing that when we want to finish recording. So let's get this job done. This video is getting a little bit larger in length. So, running through our steps. The square in the top left to select all the cells on this whole worksheet. Home tab, arrow in the corner of that number group to open up the Format Cells dialog box, or however you'd like to get that done. Protection tab, make sure they're unlocked. I'm going to turn it on and turn it off again to force that into play, and to click OK so the cells are unlocked. And I can see the green triangles appear there. Straight into the Find and Select button on the Home tab and tell it to select all the cells that contain a formula. It grabs them free. Back into the Format Cells dialog box using this arrow or some other approach. Protection tab, lock the cells. Lock the selected cells. Done. Now what I'm going to do is go into, what I might do actually first is I'm going to click a vacant cell to deselect them. Review tab, protect the sheet, and just click OK. I don't want to change any of them settings. Data is protected. I'm going to go straight to that blue square down the bottom and stop the recording. I see the blue square disappear, replaced with the record macro button. So my macro is done. No nice messages appearing, saying congratulations Alan, that is a fantastic macro you've just created, well played. Nothing like that. We have to have a little bit of faith that it must have worked. I don't have a clicky button at the moment to run that. We're going to look at different techniques for that over the coming tutorials, but for now we have our first macro. Hello and welcome to this tutorial where we will look at saving a spreadsheet that contains a macro as a macro-enabled file. Now, I have a spreadsheet open at the moment, which is currently in the state of after the very first video, where we have recorded or we have written a macro, and at the moment it's still as a .xlsx type, file type. So it's a normal spreadsheet, but it contains a macro. If I was to go up and look at saving this file with my floppy disk button at the top there, immediately I should get this warning, where Excel warns me that there is a VB project on here and that I shouldn't save it as a macro-free workbook. If I want to continue saving as macro-free, I could click yes, but otherwise I should click no and choose macro-enabled from the file type list. If I save as a macro-free workbook, it will remove my macro, so that is not a good idea. And if we're saving macros to files, we have to save them as macro-enabled files. Very good that we get this warning, so that's kind of protecting us in a way from such a mistake, but important that we do so. Now I could click no here, and it would immediately take me to immediately take me to my Save As dialog box. Alternatively, I can look at doing that manually just through File, Save As. I'm going to click No as I'm at this stage, so I get the Save As dialog box, which will be familiar with anyhow. Depending on the version of Windows you have, it may look a bit different to this, but saving just as any file. And what I'm going to do is down the bottom here, where it's currently saving as an Excel workbook, I'm going to change that to an Excel macro-enabled, where are you, workbook, which is a .xlsm extension. I'll click that, and I'll keep it as the same name, Protect Formulas. That will work just fine. And I'm going to save that. So now it's a .xlsm file type, and I'll look at closing that file down. So now we've saved it, it's going to keep the macro so that it will be available in future versions. If I close that file down and look at opening that file up again, Protect Formulas, immediately it opens back up. Notice that I get what they call a message bar, I believe, this yellow bar along the top, with security warning saying that macros have been disabled. Would I like to enable them? Save it as a macro-enabled file, seeing a .xlm extension at the top there, which you may not see on your version of Excel. It's a setting you can choose on or off. Does not immediately enable them. If I send this to Fred, who works in the Hong Kong office, then the macro is not going to be immediately available to him, or it depends on his security settings, to be fair. But it is there. They would have to enable them. This is a security feature to ensure that if you've downloaded this file off the internet, or you've been emailed it from somebody you've not met before, a new client maybe, then you're initially protected. It might be dangerous. Unfortunately, people do use this as a way of delivering malicious software, so you do have to be careful. It is programming, but for the most part in a business scenario, you probably know this individual. It may even be yourself, and we can enable it. Just to mention on that scenario there, that if I go into my File tab, and if I go to my Options button, and into the Trust Center settings, and I have this macro settings option, because you can change your macro security settings. Now this is probably controlled by IT within your company, so it's not my place to tell you what you should or should not do here, or even if you're able to do it. That should be controlled centrally. But from a personal viewpoint, it's up to you what you do here. Notice the option to enable all macros and you'll never get that setting again can be chosen. They say it's not recommended. Microsoft aren't going to say, oh yeah, go and do that, because you could be sent something malicious. is potentially dangerous. So the default, and the one I keep because I get sent a lot of files, is to disable all macros but with the notification. But there are other settings there. You can full on disable them or allow everything should you be that free in your life. But that is us saving it as a macro enabled file, essential if you do have a macro on a file. Hello and welcome to this tutorial where we're going to look at adding a button onto our quick access toolbar which will run our macro. So I have this spreadsheet that contains a macro, but at the moment there is no way of triggering it. I don't have a clickable button to run that macro. The only way I could run it at the moment is to go to my View tab, into the Macros dialog box, which I can use at the top half of my Macros button here, and to run the macro. And that's not a bad idea, just to test it works okay before you take things any further. But that's not good enough for when you have a macro and you want it to, you want to just click a button and it will do the business. And we're going to look at 3 different places you can add a button over coming tutorials, but possibly the most common place to add a button will be the toolbar at the top of our screen, known as your quick access toolbar. You can see I've got the standard save, undo, redo buttons up there already, and I've also got a paste special values button up there, a button I use a lot and I've added at some point in time. Never a bad idea, stepping aside from macros for a moment, to look at personalising that and customising it to your needs so that you can work much more productively day by day, using the features you use a lot much quicker. Good shortcuts. For now though, I'm going for the drop down arrow on the end, and we're going for more commands because we're hunting out our macro. More commands. Drop down arrow at the top of this kind of middle section saying popular commands. We're going to change to say macros to show all the macros that we have. Now there's quite a lot showing on mine because I've got the analysis toolpack add-in installed, which is what all this other stuff is. You may even have more than what I've got there. You may have similar add-ins provided. You may have other macros. But I can see as I scroll through whether you only have this or whether you have tons of stuff in there. I can find protect formulas, the macro are recorded in the first lesson of this section of the course. And I'm going to add that across to the right. So the button goes across, it maintains that name with the underscore in there, and it has this flowchart icon. Now, first thing I'm going to mention here is at the top of this right hand side it says for all documents. So this button will be available to me in any file that I use. Now thinking about that for a moment, in the first tutorial I saved this macro to this file only. So by making this button available in any file, it'd be redundant anywhere else. If I opened up a different file and clicked this button, it will moan at me and say, where is your macro? I cannot find the macro to run. So it might make more sense, well that's not a terrible thing to keep it as it is, to remove that button. And I'm going to change this drop down arrow at the top here to this file only. Now I believe I'm right in saying that that functionality came out in the 2010 version of Excel. So depending on what version of Excel you're using, you may not be able to create a toolbar specifically for one type of file. But I believe it was 2010 and then onwards that became available. If not, just save it to the general toolbar. It's not a terrible thing. But I'm going to add that across now, so this button is only available, along with the others, although I don't see them, only in this file. And my next step is going to be to use this modifier button at the bottom of the right hand side, where most importantly really I can look at changing the name. and I'm going to change to protect cells with formulas. I can use spaces now for a better display name. I don't have to worry about things I can't do, such as using spaces or starting with numbers in my name. I can also change the image. Now, there's not many images there that really say protect formulas. I'm going to quick scan to see if there's anything half decent. I might go for an anchor, maybe that sort of similar. I don't know, not really. I'm going to choose that anchor because I like it, and I'm going to click OK. So now my icon is an anchor, and my name is protect cells with formulas. If I click OK, that button becomes available on my spreadsheet. And if I went to review for a moment and unprotected this sheet, because it is still actually protected, and then I went and hit that anchor button, it protects the spreadsheet again. If I go back to review, it's protected. So that's gone through them steps of unlocking everything, selecting the cells of formulas, locking them and protecting it. Now available just at the click of a button on the end of the toolbar there. If I quickly created a new spreadsheet, if I do Control N for a new file, I can see that that anchor is not there. It is only available in that one file. If it was there, I'd click it, it would moan at me and say it can't run a macro. That's not a terrible thing. It's it's not ideal, but I've managed to isolate it to this file, which is, I would say, better. So we've got our first way of triggering a macro there, first of a few as this course progresses, but possibly the most popular place to put one on, because it is the quickest way of accessing it, apart from a keyboard shortcut, is that we can click that button at the top from any sheet, any ribbon tab, it's there for us. Hello and welcome to this video tutorial on customizing the ribbon. Now, fresh off the back of the last tutorial where we looked at adding buttons to our toolbar at the top to trigger the macros that we have created, we're now going to look at adding buttons to this ribbon below it. Not as quick with its access as the toolbar at the top, working this tabular structure, but the main benefit being its size of the ribbon. It's a lot larger, more potential to personalise it and to add more functions to it as to the slightly smaller toolbar. Now, to do this, I'm going to right mouse click anywhere on that ribbon and go into customise the ribbon. This is probably the fastest way of getting into this customise area. And it's probably worth mentioning that you cannot customise the ribbon in versions prior to 2010. Functionality came out in 2010. In older versions, you may be able to create your own toolbars and definitely add buttons to the toolbar like the previous tutorial, but you cannot modify the ribbon at a basic level. Not without VBA anyway. So, going into from 2010 plus, we're going to customise the ribbon. And on the right hand side, we can see the tabs currently visible and they are checked. What we're going to do is look at adding our own tab to this. Now, you are a little bit restricted to what you're allowed to do. They don't allow you to kind of remove functions from current groups or do too much to existing groups. So, for example, in the dialog box and in the ribbon in the background here, we can see that the Home tab has this clipboard group and this font group, and you're a little bit restricted to what you're allowed to do to them. You see, you're not allowed to do much to their features. They're all ghosted out and so forth. But you are allowed to add your own groups to them tabs, and you're allowed to create your own tabs, and that's what we're going to look at doing. I'm going to select the Home tab in this right hand side and click New Tab at the bottom to create my own tab just after that. Now, the only reason I've selected Home is so that my tab would appear one after Home. I can always use these arrows on the right to reorder them tabs into the way that I deem appropriate. If I want it to be the first tab on there, I can make it be so. And probably more importantly, I can rename them. If you have New Tab, I don't think you're going to be happy with it being named like that. I'm going to select it, click rename at the bottom and name it as macros. So I've got my own tab for all of the macros that I've generated. I'm then going to select my new group and rename that as well. They start you off with one group. Protecting data. We can add our own groups to this, but we can also rename what we have. What I'm going to do is I'm going to select my macros tab and go for the new group button at the bottom as well. I'm going to add in one more group and rename them. Now we can add as many groups in as we want, depending on the space that we have on that ribbon. I'm going to name this reporting tools. Just trying to provide meaningful names where we can logically group, in this scenario, the macros that we've created. I'm now going to select my protecting data group, and in this kind of middle section I'm going to choose macros, just like we did on the previous tutorial from the drop down list at the top there, and I'm going to hunt out the macro that I want and add it across to the group that's currently selected, which is protecting data. And also, just like the previous tutorial, we can change the image that's visible and also the name. This time we'll do it by selecting the macro and choosing rename at the bottom. And once again, I can call this protect cells with formulas or some other kind of meaningful name, and choose hopefully a meaningful image. I'm going for the hand this time, palming people away. You cannot change that cell, it has a formula in. I'm going to click OK, and I have my new looking button. Now I know I've named this tab macros, and I could rename it if I wanted to be fussy here, but just for a quick example, it doesn't have to be macros only that you add to this. We're on a macros or a VBA course here, so that's going to be our primary objective. But Excel's got loads of built-in features. You're certainly not just limited to that. Why would you want to limit yourself to that? There's loads built in that we could just go and use. So just scanning down my list here, thinking, what could I use? I want to try and grab some of a feature that sort of says protection. Where am I going? I've gone straight past protection. What's my alphabet like? I've got protect sheet. Let's throw protect workbook in there. Protect workbook. I'm going to add that across. Oh, let's publish as PDF. That's a sort of protection sort of scenario. Surely PDFs are read only in most cases. Yeah, then reporting tools, I can add more macros, etc. Let's just add one more thing in there. Let's just throw in a print area, just so we've got something in that group. So I've got my macro in there, which I've renamed for a different icon. I've also thrown in some inbuilt features as well. Now I've got all commands selected at the moment, so a huge list. Great potential for personalising stuff. Creating your macros that we'll be doing throughout this course. The world is your oyster. I'm going to click OK at the bottom to save them changes, close the box, and I have a macros tab on the ribbon just at the top there before home. There's my macro. I've also got the others that I added. I've got the protect workbook button, the print area button in these groups. Huge amount of space for more there. More potential maybe on the ribbon here, although not quite as fast to access. You have to go to the tab first. Is it protected? It's not. Let's quickly give our macro a go. Let's click that hand. Done. Sheet protected. An alternative way of triggering our macro there by customizing the ribbon. Hello and welcome to this next lesson of this course, where we are going to look at adding a button to our worksheet to trigger that macro. So I'm looking at putting a button maybe around about here on the worksheet that I can click to trigger our protect formulas macro. So we've already seen adding buttons to the toolbar at the top, probably the most popular place to put a button. then the ribbon, and now we're looking at on the sheet. The kind of third and final way for now of actioning the macro. Now to do this, up on our ribbon, we will need a tab called a developer tab, which at the moment is not visible on my ribbon. You may have it on yours, you may not. It's not shown by default, so there's a fair chance you don't, unless you've dabbled with macros and VBA in the past. But it should be at the end here. Now to bring that into our view, to make it available to us, I'm going to right click anywhere along that ribbon and go for Customize the Ribbon. And on here I can see this checkbox on the right hand side, which I can tick for developer, which is going to make that developer tab visible on our screen. So I'm going to tick developer, click OK, and now the developer tab is available to us. And with that tab visible now, we have this insert button, roughly halfway along that list of commands we have. And I'm going for the very first control, which is our button form control. Give that a click. We will then need to draw it onto our sheet. So I've got this crosshair on my mouse. I'm just going to click and drag to roughly draw the size of a button that I want. We can always move or resize it after, so we don't need to be too accurate at this point. But as soon as I release my mouse button, Excel will prompt me for what macro I would like to assign to that button. I'm going to choose the Protect Formulas macro here and click OK. So now I have a clickable button that will run that macro. Next logical task here, I guess, would be to change that name. Button 1 doesn't really signify what it does, so I'm going to call it Protect Formulas, and I'm going to take that a step further if I can. There's trouble selecting that text there. I am going to make that text bold, and that's it. Maybe make the button a tiny bit larger. So we can play around with the formatting aspects, resize it, change the format of the text. You're limited to what you're allowed to do. I can see the amount of grey options we have along the top here. Now, there's not that much I can do to that button, but there are some formatting elements we can do. Sorry. As soon as I click away from that button, it becomes live. So I can see as I hover my mouse that that button is now ready to go. If I was to click it, it would run that macro. If I right mouse click on it, it will then take me back into this kind of design view aspect of it. So I can look at editing that text, or maybe now just click on my button. I've got the potential to edit the text there, move it maybe, resize it, anything I might be looking at doing. The moment I click off it again, it's back and it's become live. So that is us adding our button form control onto our sheet. Now, before we look at tidying this video up, it's probably worth a mention that we can also assign macros to other clickable objects, not just buttons. So for example, I could go to the Insert tab and insert a shape onto this worksheet. And some of the benefits of inserting a shape over a button may be that they're more versatile. There's a greater aspect that you can format it as there is to them grey buttons. Now, I don't have to pick something crazy. I could just pick a rectangle, so it's going to look like that button, if that's the look I'm going for. But as I draw it in, the difference is clear. I've got this blue colour, and immediately the Drawing Tools tab livens up. It gives me the potential to format it further should I want to. I can start typing, and that will start adding some text onto there. So I can add text just the same. That text will also need a little bit of tidying up. So I could just spend a quick 2 seconds doing that. Let's center this stuff, bold it, make it black. Here we go, looking a bit better. And the final step would be to assign the macro, the most important thing to it. To do that, I'm going to right mouse click on the shape and go to Assign Macro. Fantastic. I'm going to assign the Protect Formulas macro. Click OK, and I now have two buttons that will run this formula. If I click off that shape, it's live. So now if I click the shape, it's protected. Let me pop up to the Review tab and unprotect that sheet. And also if I click my button, same job. So both of them will trigger that macro. Buttons on a sheet, very popular for macros that run off kind of forms that get filled in, or to position on dashboards and other kind of analysis sheets and reports, that sort of scenario. Hello and welcome to this tutorial where we are going to start to look at editing the code of our macro. So this is what we've been waiting for. We looked at recording and adding buttons to trigger it, but now it's time to start delving into the VBA aspect. And to begin with, we're going to look at making a small addition to our existing macro to take it that step further. We've got this macro that protects the formulas of our sheet, and I have this toolbar button on my ribbon, this anchor, that will run that macro. Macro seems to work absolutely fine. The one thing that we haven't really catered for though in this macro is what to do if the sheet is already protected. So if I was to click the anchor at the moment, it would run the macro and protect the sheet, and our job is done. But what if somebody just came up and hit that button? This is what we get. We get this error, unable to set the locked property of range class. So it kind of falls apart and it can't perform its job. So I'm just going to click End on that and come back, and I'm going to unprotect the sheet myself. But what we're going to look at doing is adding some extra code there that will check if the sheet is already protected, and if it is, it's going to tell the user that and then come out of the macro. So what we've decided to do is not continue with protecting it. We're just going to kind of pull out of the macro and let the user know the issue. Now, if the user's able to, then great. If not, then maybe they weren't meant to anyway. Now in reality, what you go with this, you may decide that unprotecting it is the right choice. This is just what we're going as a demonstration of what we could do in this macro. First thing we need to do is see our code. Now to do this, I'm going to go to the View tab and the Macros button on the far right hand side. I'm going to go for the top half of that button to open up the Macros dialog box so that I can see our macro, our Protect Formulas macro. And I'm going to click Edit on the right hand side to look at making some changes to that macro. And this will show us that code in what's known as the Visual Basic Editor. This is where we're going to be spending all our time throughout this course, writing our own code, changing it, learning it, everything that we need to do. So we have a separate tutorial coming up soon that's going to explain some of the key areas of this window as we delve into the code inside a little bit more hardcore. For now, all I'm concentrating on is this area in the middle where I can see the code behind our macro. I have this Protect Formulas macro, and then we've got these lines that are actually performing the job. They're selecting all the cells, they're unlocking them and saying that formulas are not hidden, then selecting the cells that have the formulas, locking them and keeping formulas not hidden, selecting range A3 to deselect our selection, and then performing the protection. What I'm looking at doing is before any of that happens, so before cells.select, I want to add to this code to check if the sheet is already protected. If it is, then there's no need to do any of this stuff. So I'm just going to click to the left of that line and press enter or return a couple of times to find myself a little bit of space. And I'm going to write if active sheet dot protect contents equals true, then, and I'm going to tab in, I'm going to write MSG box space, put in some speech marks and write the worksheet is already protected, closing speech marks, new line, exit sub, and an end if. So what I've written there is 4 new lines. I'm going to perform a test to see if the worksheet is already protected. If it is, I'm going to display a message box to the user with this message, and then I'm going to exit the macro. I'm going to abort that macro. And that's just a closing statement to if. The same way that you'd write an if function and use an opening and closing bracket in Excel, think of that as a closing bracket for if. Has to be there. Otherwise, if that's not the case, it's just going to continue with our macro. So not much of an explanation there on what they do. This is just a real quick example as we build our way in. Try no nonsense, get in the content, get it in there. We want to look at adding to our macro and performing that little bit extra to kind of whet our appetite. What we are seeing though, especially 2 things here, an if then else statement and a message box function, an inbuilt VBA function. It is certainly not the last time we'll be seeing them in this course. They'll be coming back later with stronger explanations as to how to write them and why we use them, but they are 2 extremely common lines of code, and as I say, it's certainly not the last time we'll be seeing them throughout this course. For now, I'm going to click this X in the very top right hand corner, the very top X, to close down this window. What state I'm in at the moment, my worksheet is not protected. Let's click the anchor, does the job. It's now protected. Let's press the anchor again, and I get this message box telling me the worksheet is already protected. I click OK, no error this time. We've got our own customized message letting the user know what's going on. Try it again. Still protected. I unprotect it and then try it. Does the job. So we've added our extra lines of code, which we have to do. You can't record yourself doing that. We needed VBA to put that decision making lines of code in there, to put in that message box so that we can kind of talk to the user. These are elements that you cannot record, and this is what this course is all about. Hello and welcome to our next video tutorial, where we are going to look at using relative references whilst recording a macro. So throughout this course we're going to look at different ways that you can reference cells. Obviously very difficult to use Excel without that ability. For now we're going to look at, when recording, how we can provide this functionality of relative references. Now, first of all, we need an example of what we're going to do, and this is it. I have 2 sheets on this workbook. The second one is called July. So in reality this would be whatever the month is. For now it's July. Next month it will be a different month. Whatever that current month is, what we want to do is we want to grab all of this data, everything that got recorded all of these orders as they are for that month, and we want to move that information to the bottom of this sort of like master sheet. So we want to find the bottom and store it in there. We want to remove any formulas that are in play. There's not many, but there's some in here, column J. We want to remove them. We don't need them anymore. We've got the answer. We're sort of kind of archiving it to this master sheet. This sort of transactional, this kind of consolidation macro. Very common business need, this kind of situation. Okay, so without beating around the bush, we're going to get straight in and we're going to record this and move it over there. Bit of explanation as we go, very brief explanation, so we can try and concentrate as much as we can do on the coding side of things. So we're going to start a recording, View tab, bottom half of macros, record macro, and we're going to give this macro a name, which I'm going to call consolidate orders. Let's put a capital for that, do a little capital, and I'm going to store it in this workbook, no shortcut key, no description. I'll click OK, so it begins to record what we're doing. And what we're going to do is on this July sheet, I'm going to click in cell A2 to select the very first cell of the sheet, excluding the headings. I want to keep the headings ready for the next month. Now I'm going to use a keyboard shortcut combination. I'm going to hold down Control and Shift and use the down arrow on the keyboard to select everything to the bottom of that column, and follow it with Control, Shift and the right facing arrow to select everything to the end of that row. So there's a nice quick way that I can select that list. A nice relative way of selecting as well, that large list, no matter how big or how small it may have been. Now I'm going to take a copy of that data, any way you want to copy. I'm going to go to the Home tab for it. Then I'm going to move to the Consolidate Macro sheet, that kind of master sheet here. And I'm going to scroll to the top of it and click in cell A2, which is the first kind of cell, the first record of this sheet. This time I'm going to do the Control down arrow, no Shift key, just Control down arrow, because that will move me to the last record within this list. So I'm trying to find the bottom of the list here. So I've clicked on the top record, used the Control down arrow shortcut to get to the bottom. Now what I need to do is move one more cell down, because I need to be in this new row, the next empty row. And at the moment I'm not quite there. So let's be clear, the next cell down is A 2157. Now that is not the cell I want. I'm not interested in A2157. Yes, that is the name of this cell, that is the reference, but next time we run that, that is not the reference. So I don't want to be that specific about the cell. I want to record the nature of going to the next cell down, a relative way of referencing that cell. So I'm going to go to my View tab on the ribbon, the drop down arrow below macros, and I'm going to choose the option to use relative references. I'm going to turn relative references on. So now when I move to the next cell down, A2157, however you move into that cell, it should record the action of moving one more cell down, as opposed to the action of going to cell A2157. Once that's done, back to the drop down arrow, and I'm going to toggle that option off, so we return back to absolute cell references. Next task is to paste that information in. I'm going to go to the Home tab, drop down arrow for paste, and I'm going for the values and number formatting option. this 1, 2, 3 and a percentage sign. I'm going to paste all of that in there. Once that's all pasted in, I can see that it keeps the area selected. Just about, it's right at the bottom of the screen there. You can see the area selected. What I'm going to do is scroll to the top and click on cell A2. So I'm just doing that to kind of deselect the area, take the user back to the top of the sheet, working with the assumption that that's probably where they'd like to be taken to when they first move to this sheet. You may disagree. But then I'm going to go to the July sheet, where that data is still selected from our copy. I'm going to go for the... Do I clear that? I don't want to see it. I'll clear it. I'm going to go to the clear button and I'm going to clear all. I'm going to wipe them cells clean, ready for the next kind of fresh bit of data. And I'm going to click on cell A2 there as well to deselect what was highlighted there. And then I'm going to stop this macro because that seems to be everything we want to do. So I'm going for this blue square at the bottom of our screen and I'm going to stop the recording. So we have ourselves a macro that grabs all the data stored that month, moves it to the bottom of the list on the consolidate macro sheet, pasting values in number formatting only, and then clears it from the month sheet ready for the next month's orders to be entered. This has been used to use relative references within this list, the action that we had to move one cell down once we got to the bottom of this list. Two more steps really on this video I think to do. Next step will be to create a button on our ribbon that will run, on our toolbar I'm going to go for, that will run this macro. It's a bit of a refresher here from an earlier video. Going for the drop down arrow, more commands, macros from our drop down list at the top there, find consolidate orders and add it across, and then we can look at changing the name or image for this modify button at the bottom. So I could choose that person and say to consolidate orders without the underscore there, and I've got a button that runs it. And the next step really is that we can't finish this macro without having a look at the code. That's what this course is about. So I'm going for view, top half of macros, and edit, and this is what we have. So the very first thing was to select cell A2, select all the data, copy it, move to the other sheet. Then I've got all of this scroll row stuff. What is all that about? Now that stuff is me scrolling up with the scroll bar, just like I am now when I was on that sheet. It's completely harmless stuff, but it is ugly and adds confusion to this code and slows it down, and there's no reason to want to keep it, even though it's relatively harmless. So I'm going to select all of them active window scroll row lines that I can see there, and I'm just going to use delete on the keyboard to take them out. Now I'm going to do the same to this other bunch that I can see appear here. Just get rid of all of them and take them out. Fantastic. I'm going to take them lines out as well. So media code's a little bit smaller. This line here is the relative reference using an object called offset. Not the last time we're going to see that in this course. We'll be covering offset, really useful, one of the easier and therefore more popular ways of using relative references within a macro. We've got our paste special here, followed by us deselecting data and clearing and clicking an A2 and them other things that we did. Now before we leave this macro, I'm going to make a couple more changes to our code, and the next step is going to be this one here. When we clicked on that July sheet, it recorded the code of sheets July.select. Now the next month is not going to be July, so that sheet's probably going to get renamed, and this code will not update itself. Therefore, next month it will not work. So what I'm going to do is delete July and the speech marks, and I'm going to type 2. So I've changed the way that I reference the sheet. Instead of saying use the sheet called July, I'm saying use the second sheet of the workbook. So it's also a relative way, again, as opposed to absolute reference by the sheet name, of referencing that sheet. More on that as well as we go through this course, but I'm going to copy that as well back to the top of our code. I also want that line as the very first line. Reason being, when we started recording, we were on the July sheet, so it did not record us selecting the sheet. It just went straight into A2. The button that runs the macro is on the toolbar, so I cannot guarantee where the user is the moment they click the button. They may be on the consolidate macro sheet. So the first thing I'm going to do is move them to that sheet if that's the case, using sheet 2 because I don't know what it's called, and then onwards we go. I'll keep this one here because I'm working on the assumption that that name's not going to change. Now, absolute references here, relative references here, and that is our code. Maybe if you wanted to add one more thing, I might add a message box at the bottom. Bit pointless this, but just as a nice finishing factor, and saying, wow, that month's orders have been consolidated. Lovely message at the end there. Let's close that code window down. If I did want to give this a trial run, I'd need some information. So what I'm going to do is just grab a chunk of what we had there, just for demonstration purposes. If you are creating a macro, you're typically going to use a sample file, a backup of your data, rather than the real thing, just to make sure it works so you don't damage anything. So with that in mind, I can play around with existing data. It doesn't have to be accurate, as long as it's the same structure as what you'd normally do when you're kind of testing these macros out. I'm going to copy that in and pretend for the moment that this is new information that I need to archive. So I'm going to pop to my person sitting on the toolbar there, my consolidate orders button, and give it a click, and the job is done. Finishing with that message there and leaving us on this July sheet. This one is called July. Notice it continued to work when we reference it as a second sheet as well. Wow, that month's orders have been consolidated. Nice clean sheets there. Back to consolidate macro. Let's have a look at what we've got. It's going to be difficult to tell the difference to whether it works or not. But all that data has been moved across in there. You can see the number of 26 there actually, so we can see quite clearly that has been moved to the bottom of that list. And this video was here to look at using relative references in a macro. As a byproduct, we had a look at some other elements of code, but they'll be covered again and again as we power through all of these fancy VBA techniques and just what it could do for you and your work. Hello and welcome to this video tutorial where we are going to introduce ourselves to the Visual Basic Editor. Now this is something we have seen a couple of times already, but we've not took the time to have a look around it as yet. We've always dived straight into our code. Also, the way we've got it to appear so far has been to go through editing our macros, which is not a terrible thing, but typically there is a quicker way of getting to it. And that quicker way is to go to the Developer tab and the Visual Basic button that you see on the far left. As I hover over that button, it also tells me that the keyboard shortcut of holding down Alt and pressing F11 would also open that editor. And that is the way that I would tend to work. Alt and F11 to quickly switch to the Visual Basic editor. As I'm on it, I'm going to click that Visual Basic button, and this is the editor. So along the top it still looks quite old school, you know, the old optionals of versions of Office where you have your menu bars to access various tools, and you've got the toolbar below it with various tools. The middle area is blank at the moment, and on the left hand side we've got two different windows. The first one is known as the Project Explorer, and the second one is our Properties window. Now when you go into the editor, you may not see them there by default. You typically would, they would be there straight away, but I cannot guarantee what you or somebody else may have done in the past on that machine or laptop or whatever you are using. If they do not appear there, we can get access to these from the View menu on at the top of our screen. So I'm going to see the Project Explorer here and the Properties window. They are the two windows that we can see on the left of my screen right now. Some of the options directly above that, such as the Locals window, there will be other stuff that we'll see throughout this course. Personally, a big fan of the Locals window, so that will definitely get some coverage. And also things like code and objects at the top there as well. Looking at the windows we have, this Project Explorer, as they call it, I can see I've got two projects. I have Book 2, which is the file open at the moment in my version of Excel. You would see all the files that you have open there if you have more than one. I can also see personal.xlsb, which is that hidden workbook, the personal macro workbook, where I can store macros so that they're globally available to me for any file. Once again, you may not see that yourself. If you've not used it before, it would not have been activated. More on that later on. But I've got two projects, as they are known. Within the file I've got open, it shows me 3 sheets and then the book. So however many sheets you've got open, and they'll have their name there, and the book itself. These are different objects, different things that we can access and write code to them or use their events, this kind of stuff. If I double click on any of them objects, such as this workbook, it would open up a code window on the right for that object, so I can start to write code for it. I can see, I just double clicked on it so I know this, but right at the top of our screen I can see it says this workbook code. Handy that, because all your code windows will look the same. So it's good at the top that we can reference what object or what module am I in, what code is this. So for example, if I double click on sheet 1, I get another code window. Along the top I can see this is the code window for sheet 1. I can double click on this workbook and I'm back to there. In the top right of this screen you do get your normal kind of minimize and restore buttons that you'll be familiar with. Personally, just double clicking will get you between these windows. You may decide to close one down at some point with the X, but personally I never bother with minimizing and stuff. We can just switch between them by double clicking. Now, although I mentioned writing our code in here, and at some point in this course we will, because we'll be covering a topic called events, and that is when we're going to look at adding code to sheets and to books. If you're not running your code off a worksheet event, such as somebody moving a sheet, or to a workbook event, like somebody opening a workbook or saving a workbook, then what you should be doing is adding your code to a module. That is where Excel put our recorded code from earlier, it put it into a module. At the moment I don't see any modules on the left hand side. What I'll need to do is go to the Insert menu and into Module from there. And as I click Module, I get this modules folder and the module itself appear. And this code window now, I can see at the top of the screen, is relating to that module, module 1. So you can create as many modules as you like, you can rename them, and you can add as many macros to them as you like. Just think of these modules as a storage container for your macros. In the same way that you probably create folders to store your emails, there's no need for you to do that whatsoever. The only reason you do that is so that you can organize them better, you can find your email within the relevant folders and so on. How many folders you create, what you call them, is completely up to you. The same idea here. I could put 20 macros all in one module. I could, put a different macro in a different module. However I decide to organize them for me or my team's benefit. Now the window below that Project Explorer is the Properties window. There's not too much to say about that just yet. The only thing they're really showing in there for module 1 is the ability to rename that module as mentioned. That will come up the main area later, being when we start looking at user forms, and we'll be naming controls and playing around with a lot more of the settings that you get in there. You get a lot more properties. For now, it's not offering us too much, but we'll see that as I do click on other objects, I will get different properties for them. So that will be contextual depending on what object we have selected at any given point. Or be able to modify some of its properties. So for now, that is all we're going to cover, talking about this Visual Basic Editor. This is an introduction to it. If I click the X in the very top right hand corner of this editor, it will close it back down and take me back to my Excel screen. So that VBE, or that Visual Basic Editor, is a separate window entirely to Excel. It uses Excel to run, but it's a separate window. So when I click Visual Basic, it opens up. I can close it down fully and I'm back to my spreadsheet. Or indeed, I can click Visual Basic to open it up. I can use my taskbar at the bottom, or look at things like minimizing and stuff to get to my spreadsheet. And I can always use things like Alt and F11 to switch back to it. It's a quick way of getting back there. And we're back into our editor. Hello and welcome to this video tutorial where we are going to look at writing our first macro. So exciting stuff. This is where we're going to start writing one from scratch. And it's just going to be a simple example to begin with, to get familiar with VBA grammar and how you can begin and lay out our macro, our code. So what we're going to look at doing is just writing a simple little macro that when we click a button, we'll put today's date in cell B1 and it will increment the value in cell B2 by 1. So it should change 351 to 352, but whenever we click it, if I clicked it tomorrow, it would put in tomorrow's date as it would be, and then 353 if we had already changed it to 352, but incremented by 1. And then we might get it to display a quick little message at the end, like we saw in one of our previous tutorials. So first thing is to get that Visual Basic Editor, the VBE, open. And we can do that from the Developer tab and Visual Basic, or the keyboard shortcut of Alt and F11. So that will open our VBE. Open it pops Project Explorer on the left there, showing that I have a file open called First Macro. I've got 3 sheets in the workbook, but at the moment I do not have a module that I can use to store my code in. So I'm going to insert one. I'm going to go to the Insert menu and Module. Make sure before I do that I am somewhere within the project that you want. You may only have one project or one file there. If not, make sure you're somewhere within that hierarchy so that when you do insert the module, it appears within there. And you'll get a modules folder with a minus sign to collapse and plus to expand that list, and one module with the window immediately opened. Remember from earlier that we know that's that module 1 window, because along the top it says first macro.xlsx module 1 code. So I know the project and object that I'm in. Now we can see in the properties window just below the Project Explorer that I can rename that module if I want. So I might call it first macro. Not a legal object name. What have we done? No spaces. Remember, within macro names, and as we go through this course, obviously module names, also things like variables, and no spaces in the names that you provide. If you see that it's asking you for a caption or a label, you can generally put names in that. That's something that's visible, but not in the actual name. So a bit of a recap there. Let's change that to first macro with an underscore. Is it happy with that one? It is. Now you can see it's renamed within the Project Explorer. Okay, the macro itself. Now a macro in VBA is known as a sub-procedure or sub-routine. This is the proper term for it. We can call it a macro still, it's interchangeable, that name. But it's known as a sub-routine or sub-procedure. And the reason for that is because we're going to start with the word sub. Space and then the name of this macro. Let's say I'm going to call it new ID. I'm clearly making this stuff up. I'm going to call it new ID. No spaces, so I've got an underscore there separating them. Another common approach is one known as camel casing, where we can join our words together using capitals to separate the changing words. I'm going to keep that now I've got it, and I'm going to press enter. So enter as usual would put you onto a new line. What it also does is put these parentheses on the end. Now we didn't have to write them, but your macros or your sub-procedures should always have them brackets at the end. At some point throughout this course we may well be using them. We'll be using it to pass arguments and variables and stuff. But for now we can just rely on the fact that Excel is going to pull it in for us. Also capitalises the S of sub. Don't know if you noticed, but I wrote that all in lowercase for speed purposes. Turns it blue to show it's a reserved keyword. It knows what that word is. You're also not allowed to use that word as a name of a macro or module or variable. It also puts end sub in, so I've got a kind of framework here for my macro. All my code would go in the middle of them two lines that they've created. Now it's not necessary, but a very good idea for me to press enter a couple of times to get some white space in there, and then to maybe move into the middle line and use my tab key to indent. Function wise, it is not necessary to do that stuff, but universal practice. Any macro you come across via Google or reading the book will be using this way of laying out their code. It brings clarity to it, so it's much easier for you or your colleagues to read now or at a later date. You see, yeah, that's what it's all about. It's about the clarity of it. And we'll see this practice, especially the indentation of code and these extra spaces, just to, there is some kind of universal way of working here, which we'll stick to as much as we can, because it's what you're going to see out there when you're doing it for real. But also you can add your personal touch on this. What makes sense to you? What's a logical way of displaying this code to make it as easy to read and understandable as you can? Remember, you might be coming back to this in 2 years' time and you'll forget all about what you did and you need to get up to speed quickly. Okay, now the first thing we're going to do is we're going to put the date in cell B1. So I've got this Visual Basic editor open. Remember that I can always restore this if I want to, and I can move it and see my spreadsheet in the background. They're two separate windows, these. And I can see that date is cell B1, ID is B2. So I'm going to write range. I've got my caps lock on there, it would seem. Let's try that again, range, but it matters that much. It would have changed it for me. Open in parentheses, then opening double inverted commas, opening speech marks. I'm going to write B1, closing speech marks, closing parentheses. So what I'm using here is what's known as an object called range, and it is one of many ways that you can select a cell within your code. It's probably the most common way. It's the way that you'll see when you're recording macros that it goes for. It's an absolute reference to that cell B1. It has to be B1. Now I'm going to put a full stop after that, or a kind of period, and I'll get this drop down list of what are known as properties and methods. Things I can do or information I can see about that cell. So there's a large list here. All the ones with an icon showing a kind of piece of paper with a finger pointing to it is known as a property. So it's a bit of information I can view or change about this cell, such as its address, which may seem silly here because it's B1 and I've just written that, but such as its address, or what else have we got in here that's good? Throw something up for me, come on. The entire row, what row is it in? Just select it there. What's its height? Does it have a formula? This kind of stuff, information about it. All the ones with this kind of flying rubber are known as methods, and a method is an action. So we can see here, apply an advanced filter, add a comment to it, calculate it, check the spelling of it, actions you can perform on it. So properties and methods. This drop down list can really help you out at times. It doesn't matter how much you do this and how used to it you get, you will forget to spell things or the exact name of something. It can jog your memory. What I'm going to go for here is I'm going to put value, which I can see is a property, what information is inside that cell. And then I'm going to follow that with an equals. Equals is known as the assignment operator within VBA. So I'm going to assign something to the value of B1. And what I'm going to write is I'm going to write date. Now date is an inbuilt VBA function that will capture today's date from your computer's clock. Now you may know from your own experience or through going through our superhero course that in Excel normally there's a function called today that will put in today's date. For some reason in VBA it is called date, not today. Same job, different name. And you see that in a few other areas as well. For example, VBA has a function called isNumeric, which is the same as an Excel function called isNumber. They're very similar but different. But there's an inbuilt VBA function to put the date in there. Okay, I'm going to press enter to move to the next line. VBA is a procedural language. Every command, every line of code has to have its own line. I can't begin writing the next code after it. It has to go in its own line. And the next line is going to increment the ID in cell B2. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a copy of the line I've already got. Copy and paste is an essential programming skill. Just copy and paste however you feel comfortable to do so. I'm just going to change the 1 to a 2 and then change the date to what I need. So copy and pasting will always save you time and improve your accuracy of your code. Definitely an essential programming skill. Now this time, once again, I'm assigning something to cell B2. This time I want to increment the current value by 1. So what I'm going to end up doing is I'm going to copy that line of code again over date, and after it put +1. So what I'm doing is, some area where it's different in VBA to what we would have done normally is that the right hand side contains the calculation. So whatever value is currently in B2 +1, and then that is assigned to B2. So it looks like we're duplicating things, we're writing this twice. And you don't normally do that when you write a formula in Excel normally. But bear in mind that equals in VBA is the assignment operator. It's a little bit different to what it is normally. So we formula on the right, or function, and then assign to what's on the left. So what we've done so far is we've seen an inbuilt VBA function. We've performed a formula, and we've been referencing cells. Not a bad start to our macro, writing our talents, hey? Next up, we should look at inserting a comment. So I'm just going to move that down one more space and put it on the line above. We can add comments on its own line, on the end of a line, however we want. And these comments can be used for different reasons, but essentially it's a line of text that does not run. So you can use it mainly to leave notes for yourself, to leave comments, explaining sections of code. So if you did return to this in 2 years' time, you can read that and know what each section means, rather than trying to interpret it all over again. There are also techniques to use it to kind of prevent lines of code from running when you're kind of troubleshooting errors. There are other reasons to add this in. But to add a comment in, all we do is we start with an apostrophe, and then we write our line of code. So I might put enter today's date and increment ID, and trying to explain what the next few lines of code do, so in the future when I come back to it I don't have to interpret this. Now these are easy lines of code, so maybe a bit pointless here, and there's no reason to overdo your commenting. That doesn't make sense and it's counterproductive. As I click off that, we notice that the line goes green. Comments always green. It says a line of code that does not run. It's only there for notes for yourself. It's a notes area. Now what we've done so far when we assign these two values, just to add a little bit more information to that, we're getting familiar with VBA grammar or VBA syntax and kind of its terminology. And you'll notice that when we use VBA, we use what's known as the object model. And we'll be doing this throughout the course, using things known as collections and objects and this other terminology. That may seem a little bit alien at first. But VBA is all about learning the object model. And fortunately, you know a lot of that already. Because you're an advanced Excel user, you already know a lot of things you can do in Excel. Things like print area, pivot table, charts, font formatting, protection, and you may already know this stuff at different levels. So you kind of know where to find it, and you've got a bit of understanding. It's not completely new, this. Now unfortunately it's not that straightforward. They will use sometimes different terms and it might catch you out a little bit, but we've got a massive head start on it. And when we use this object model, what I mean is the lines of code we write, we always write the name of an object like range, worksheets, pivot tables, charts, something like this, and then we put a full stop and we follow it with either a property or a method. So we perform, we assign information to it to a property, or we tell it to do something via a method. And this is a common theme we'll see, affecting a property or a method. It's always object dot property or method. And here we're assigning, or if it's a method, we might have to provide additional information. For example, if I press enter a couple of times, in my mind I'm just using a blank bit of line there, blank bit of white space, just to break these into two different sections to make it easier to read. And I'm going to write MSG box, something we saw on a previous video. This is an inbuilt VBA function. Now after typing that, when I press my space bar, I get this yellow box pop up. And the great thing about this, backing up what I said a moment ago, is the similarities to what you already know. And especially if you took my superhero course, we would have done a lot of different functions, over 30 different functions we would have done. And we would have spoken and seen how they're all written the same way. They have their odd little quirks at times. And this is the exact same syntax. Notice how after MSG box, they ask you to put brackets in. And then they show different arguments, different information, separated by a comma. If information is optional, it is wrapped within these square brackets. So it's saying, look, at the moment you're on one called prompt. This is mandatory. Next up is buttons, then title, then help file, then context. All four of them are optional. You don't need them unless you want them. Now you may not know what they mean. You may look at context and think, well, what does that do? How do I use it? And we can always use Google or a book we may have at home to help back us up as a reference there. But the key skill is we know how to use it. We're getting used to terminology and VBA grammar. We know we use arguments by separating them with a comma, and this is how we get going with using it. In this example, we just want to display a simple prompt. If I want to display text, we should also know from our standard Excel skills that we wrap text within speech marks, or these double inverted commas. So I can just write the ID has been where we're going, updated. Take a bow. So I've got a silly message in there. This is mainly for the purpose of showing you this this tooltip popping up, helping you, and the similarity to functions as we begin to move our way through the day. As I click off again, VBA run what they call a syntax check, and they're tidying it up, putting spaces in, capitalizing letters, checking it makes sense, we haven't made a typo or something. But I've got another message box in there now, inbuilt VBA function. I could add a comment, a very pointless thing to do really in this example, but just to cement what we spoke a moment ago, message box to chat with user. There are loads of powerful ways to use a message box. They'll be coming up again and again in this course to provide information to the user, to ask them questions and interact with them. Absolutely incredible tool. It's definitely up there with something you're going to see an awful lot in your VBA career. But here we are writing our first macro. 3 jobs is what it does, comments to lay it out, and it's neat and tidy and easy to read. And we've got a good head start here on what's known as the object model. Last thing that's left for me to do is to look at running this macro. Now there are loads of ways of doing that. The way I'm going to demonstrate to start with is this green arrow up on our toolbar known as Run Sub User Form. Mentions that F5 is the keyboard shortcut. We could use that to run this macro. But that is one way you can run your macros to test that they're working on your sample file. If I press that now, that code runs. I can see it's incremented 351 to 352. Hashes, must be a date in there, but it's not quite big enough, that column. And my message box saying that I can take a bow. I'll click OK to that and I can see it's working. Let me resize that cell. And indeed, let me delete the contents of that cell. Alt and F11 to bring back my editor. So that's one way that we can run this code. Let's recap on another way we've already seen. I'm going to click outside of there, and I'm going to go to the View tab and the Macros button. A longer way of doing things, so when you're up and running, I can't see you doing it this way, but I wanted to go this way to show you that our macro is in there. So we've seen recording macros and accessing it from this dialog box. Now we've gone into the editor and written one with our own code from scratch, but it still exists in here as a macro. Macro, sub-procedure, same thing. I can click run and that will run that code. So now it's gone to 353. It's the same date, so the date goes in as the same message box. You can see our macro running on that code and doing a job when required each time. All we'd need is a logical way of running it now with a kind of button or a toolbar or our sheet. That's something we've already covered, so we won't worry about that for now. We'll get on and start talking about some more VBA topics. Hello and welcome to this lesson on cleaning up recorded code. So the macro recorder is a fantastic tool that is always going to be there for you to quickly generate some code, faster than you could type it, but also to generate code on Excel features that you may not be too familiar with from the VBA side. So you may not know how to write the VBA code to create a pivot table, or merge and center cells, or delete an entire row, or something that you might be quite comfortable with from the Excel side. But you could always record yourself performing them actions and then work with the VBA code afterwards to either wrap it inside a loop, perform some decision making on it, or to tidy it up that little bit more. So the recorder is always going to be there for us, but it will generally generate more code than what you need. It generates a lot of redundant code, and it's not always the cleanest way of doing something. So, being able to work with that code after is essential, but it is certainly not to oversee what the recorder could do for you and how helpful it can be in kind of solving situations. Now we're going to look at a couple of classic examples of the recorder generating that extra code that's not necessary. And I'm just going to start up a recording for the first example. And I'm going to record a macro which I'll leave as macro 1. And all I'm going to do is enter some text in 3 different cells. So I'm going to click in cell B2 and I'm going to type a name in there. Then I'm going to move into cell B3 and I'm going to type a name in there. And I'm in cell B4 and I'm going to type a name in there. So I've just entered 3 bits of text into individual cells. If I stop my recording, and I'm going to go and have a look at the generated code by editing the macro. And this is what we get. So we can see I've got 7 lines of code to write, text inside 3 different cells. Now it's had to select cell B2 before it then writes the name John Steele into it, and then select cell B3 before it writes the name Sarah Harding into it, and so on. Now it's not necessary to select a cell to perform an action on it, but you'll notice the macro recorder will generally do that. So we can shorten these statements by removing the select element and by putting it all on one line. So I'm going to take out the select element and then the following active cell.formula R1C1. We don't need that. We also don't need this period, this full stop, because I've not gone into a method like we did there with the dot select. Just the range B2 equals John Steele is good enough. Now in fact you might, and throughout this course you'll probably see me write dot value on the end of range B2 there. So I would put a property on the end of it. Now that's not necessary either. So we could, for this example, just remove that to show that is all you need. You will, however, throughout this course probably see me do that. I'm preferable to putting dot value there, believing that it makes code easier to read for the masses, whereas some people might not be sure what property they're accessing there. Now maybe with this one it's obvious because text, I'm clearly putting it inside the cell, but depending what that object is, you may not know the default property or method, of which for range it is value. Okay, I'm just going to continue and clear out these select methods, and I'm also going to remove this last select, which was generated by me pressing enter after typing Tom Cruise. So it moved to the cell below, as Excel does by default. We don't need to move to that cell. I'm going to close down this editor with them 3 lines. Delete the names from the cells and click elsewhere. I'm going to run that macro, which will just re-enter them 3 names. So you've got less than half of the code that we had originally there. It was 7 lines, it's now 3. It's a quick and easy example of the redundant code that the recorder generated. However, although we've already written this ourselves on this course already, it also showed it generating code that we may not have known maybe beforehand. A simple example for now, but you've got some code that we could then work with afterwards. Okay, for a second example, I'm going to start up a recording again, which I'm going to leave as macro 2. And on this example, we're going to look at the use of a dialog box. And I'm just going to look at formatting some cells. So I'm going to select them 3 names, B2 to B4 there, and I'm just going to do a couple of examples of formatting that text. I'm going to make it bold. I'm going to change the font size to size 12, and I've decided to center align it as center align. Okay, I'll stop that recording and we'll go and have a look at what our code looks like. Macro 2 and edit, and this is what we get with uses of dialog boxes. Notice how much code we've got now, but in all of that I've got the initial selection of them 3 cells. If you wanted this to work in any given situation based on user selection, then we don't even need that. If it's always going to work on B2 to B4, then I should have that in there. And for now I might leave that. We've then got turning it bold, we need that. And then we've got this use of the font dialog box. So even though I didn't directly use the dialog box, I changed it on the ribbon, it's recorded everything from the font dialog box. And the only thing I changed in there is the size. So I don't need this Calibri mention, and I don't need all the stuff after it. Now it's the first time on this course that we've seen this with construct as well. That we're saying with selection.font, do this. Now because I'm doing only one thing to that, well, to be honest, I'm doing 2 because we've got bold above as well. I don't really need the with kind of construct, which is used when you're doing multiple things to an object. So I'm also going to remove the with elements of this. Let's take out these white space and move it all onto one line. So selection.font.size equals 12. And now we've got this extra with construct now, where it's looking at the the alignment group, is it? But on that format cells dialog box and the alignment tab. Now the only thing I've changed on there is the horizontal alignment, center. But once again, it's recorded everything else. Is wrapped text on or not? Did they indent? Did they merge cells? But once again, I don't need them extra options. I just need the center align. Once again, because I've only got one thing, I don't really need the with construct either. Although, looking above, these other options are using selection too. Selection.font, selection.font again, selection.horizontal alignment. So I could get these two lines and cut and paste them within this construct and remove the selection from each one. Get rid of that white space. Maybe you had one before the sub there. And we're just looking at cleaning up the way the code looks so it's easier for people to read and to work with. And also that it's faster. We don't need to make changes to settings that don't need changing. So all I've had to do is select those three cells, and within this with construct I've performed three things to the selection: center align, bold and size 12. So if I was to close down this editor, and if I can just take those settings off, bold 11, left align, and click elsewhere. If I go to run macro 2 as it is, it will go and perform those three actions again. So a couple of examples there of cleaning up recorded code. We've got the use of dialog boxes and all this additional code being created that's not necessary, and also the way the recorder selects a cell before it performs an action to it. Two classic redundant recorded code. Hello and welcome to this lesson on working with arguments when writing VBA. So whenever you use a VBA function, or when you use an objects method in VBA, you may have to write some arguments to it. You will get some mandatory and some optional arguments supplied with your methods and functions, just like you do with inbuilt Excel functions such as VLOOKUP and if and average and so on. Now you won't always have to enter some, but quite commonly you will. This extra information for that method or function to work, or to work better. Now for a quick example of different ways that you can write those arguments, I want to use the protecting workbook feature of Excel. So to refresh our memories, if I went to the review tab and clicked protect workbook, this is the dialog box that you get. That it is used to protect the structure of the book, typically to stop people unhiding sheets or inserting sheets or moving and copying sheets, and anything that is the structure of that book. And you've also got the option of windows to protect things like freeze panes and split panes, and also a password that is optional. So structure and windows, two checkboxes, password, a text box, completely optional. If I cancel that, and I'm just going to pop into the editor, so if I do Alt and F11, the keyboard shortcut to open the Visual Basic Editor, and I'm going to insert a new module within my project here, my Book 1 project. Insert module, and I'm going to start up a new macro which I'm going to call protect workbook, without spaces. And here we go. So what I want this to do is to protect a workbook, protect the workbook I'm currently on. I'm going to write active workbook, so I need to reference the workbook that I want to protect. Then I'm going to put dot and protect. So scanning through the different properties and methods that you can use on a workbook. This one being the active workbook, the workbook that the user currently has currently is in right now, the one that is active. And I'm going to look at protecting it. Now, if I put a space after protect there, it will appear with its arguments. So first of all, it's saying that I could have put parentheses around these. I can see the parentheses around the arguments here, like you typically would with a function, but you don't see people do too often in VBA. But then it prompts us for the 3 bits of information. And the reason I wanted to display it in Excel beforehand is to refresh a memory of what the dialog box asked us for. Because we see that it asks us for the same stuff here, although in a slightly different order. It asks for the password first, then the structure, then the windows. And you might remember that in the dialog box, it asks for the structure, then the windows, then the password. So let's say for a moment I don't want to use a password. I do want to protect the structure, and I do want to protect the windows. Now, one way I could write that is to put a comma in to move past the password, type true, dear me, my typing, type true for the structure, and then a comma and true for windows. So because structure and windows are checkboxes, they will have a Boolean value, they have true or false, logical value. And I'm just going to move away from that line by clicking elsewhere. And the editor is quite happy with that statement, that is going to protect the workbook without a password, but it will protect the structure and Windows elements. Now, if I close the editor down and look at running that macro, view macros and run protect workbook, it does indeed protect my workbook. If I click on review, I can see that it's lit up. If I go to view, I cannot freeze panes. And if I right mouse clicked on a sheet tab at the bottom, the structural elements are disabled. So that has protected the workbook with the structure and the windows that I wanted. But if I go to review and click protect workbook, it unprotects quite easily as there was no password. So if I switch back to our code, that works an absolute dream and was maybe quite fast for me to input. But I guess the counter argument on writing these parameters is quite clear, that that's not very descriptive as to what it does. Especially knowing that when we looked at the dialog box, it asked for structure, then windows, then password. But in VBA, it asks for password, then structure, then windows. So what I'm getting at here is if other people are working with this code, or if you are, unless you know the VBA side of protecting a workbook very well, you're not going to know the name of every single argument it has and the particular order that it goes in. Just think how much stuff Excel can do. It's impossible to know it all. You're just going to remember off your head the classic and typical things that you use, and the rest you'll find out as and when you need it, via Google or by recording yourself doing it and having a look at the code. So if I backtrack on this for a moment and look at recreating a startup by hitting space, another way we could write that, the last way I'll demonstrate for now, is that I could write structure colon equals true, and then comma windows colon equals true. So I've not bothered mentioning password as I've not done it, and when entering the other arguments I've used its name. So I've said the structure is true, the windows is true. So I'm only using the ones that are necessary. Yes, and it's quite clean to read because, as long as I'm aware of protecting the workbook, I know exactly, when I'm reading it, it says it straight off, does exactly what it says on the tin. To confirm that it works, if I close that editor and I will rerun, where am I going? Rerun this macro, run protect workbook, and that once again is protected with freeze panes and the structure, which you can undo by clicking the button because there's no password. So this was just a quick look at a couple of different ways that you can write the arguments for a method or a function. In this example, it was a method. It was the protect method of Active Workbook. So it's something that we're going to do throughout this course. You know, we can't escape, but you might see it entered in different ways, both by me during the course, but also, you know, back at your place of work or wherever you find yourself using VBA and looking at other people's code or your own code over the years. It may be written in different ways, and we have to get familiar with the different ways that we could see code written. Hello and welcome to this lesson on writing VBA to reference different cells, sheets and workbooks. Now, how could you have a macro or a sub-procedure without the need to reference the different cells of a sheet or the different sheets of a book? That would be one unique macro there. So we have to know different techniques for doing this, and there are loads of ways, absolutely plentiful of ways that you can reference different cells or different workbooks. And a lot of the ways you use will all depend on the context. So depending where you are at the point, or where the user is at the point that the macro is running. Now, are you looking at writing it to the cell the user is in, whatever that may be? Or are you looking at referencing a different sheet? Do you know that sheet by its name, or do you literally have no idea and you need another way of referencing that sheet? So this video serves as a way of looking at some of the typical examples of doing it. We're going to look at some different ways of referencing, some of the more popular ways, I would say. And what we're going to look at doing is building up a list of expenses here, a pretend list of expenses, just using some different techniques. And we're going to finish off the video looking at copying that to different sheets and different books, seeing different techniques for referencing sheets and books as well, and also as a byproduct looking at copying and pasting in VBA. Okay, so first of all, I'm just going to open the Visual Basic Editor. See if I use Alt and F11. And I'm going to insert a new module into this project and create a new sub-procedure, which I'm going to call referencing cells. So shooting through that, because it's something that we have done already during this course. And the initial way that we're going to write our first expense in is I'm going to use the range object. Now, this is also something we've already used in this course. It's, dare I say, the most popular way that you're going to see, you know, a cell referenced. And the main way it's used, although you may see it in different ways that are, let's say, far too plentiful to cover in one video, where it will be about 2 hours long, is to reference it using an absolute reference. So I'm going to write in a reference here to cell A3, which is the first cell, the first vacant row, the first cell in our expenses sheet. So using the syntax of some parentheses and the speech marks or double inverted commas around A3 there, I'm going to use dot value, the property value, to write to that cell, and I'm going to assign a number 1 as it is the first ID, our first expense. Now, an essential skill of programming any language is to copy and paste. And I'm going to copy that statement 2 more times and change the references to B3 and C3, and then what I'm assigning. So I'm going to go for, I'm going to go for some notepads. And then a value, I don't know, £2 spent on some notepads. So we've got this line that will enter it straight into that row there. So if I was to hit this play button at the top of the editor to run the macro, it runs and puts the information, and as I can see in the background there, as I have my editor restored, window restored, I can see it put it into row 3. This is our first way to reference cells, something that's not really new because we've covered that sort of technique in this course. Okay, now I'm just going to put an apostrophe to the left of those lines to comment them out. We mentioned comments in an earlier video as a technique for entering notes and entering information for yourself or for others. Normally to identify different segments of code. So I'm using it here to disable them lines. So rather than delete them, I thought I'd leave them there and just disable them temporarily. So when I save this file at the end, it will be available for download on the course and we can see the code that was written. And for my next technique, I'm going to use the object called cells. Now the example I'm going to use here is not a very good example of its use, but it's just to put that object out there early doors, ready for the remainder of this course, where it will become far more important. Cells is absolutely fantastic in use with loops. It is probably the best way of referencing a cell within a type of loop called a counter loop. For this example right now, I'm going to use it to put a new expense in row 4, and notice it asks us for the cell reference via index numbers. So the index number for row 4 is that it's number 4, comma, column index for A is 1. It is the first column, closing bracket, dot value. So yes, this is not a very good example. You don't really want to be referencing cells like, row 23, column 7. It's not very easy to do. It's extremely difficult, and even worse reading. It's just not the way to do things. But when this is used within looping, I say it is awesome. A scenario where you don't know the row and column reference, but they've been stored in things called variables, which is another topic to come in this course. So trust me, I'm throwing it out now, so it's not completely alien later on. But it would work for us right now, if not the best technique. And I can copy these, like before. This time changing the column, but instead of to B, it's to number 2. Instead of to C, it's to number 3. And think of something else I might buy. Let's say it's an ink cartridge. And that has cost me £6. And if I play this macro, it will not run the commented out code, only running these, and will use these index numbers to store that information. Okay, so there's a cells object. Now next up, and you might have been thinking this throughout this video, is that if we were doing this in reality, we don't know the next empty row. Sorry. Well, we'll do by looking, but we won't know it, just straight off the back when hitting a button, maybe, especially if it's from a different sheet. Oops. So what we're going to look at doing is writing some code to shoot to the bottom of this list, and then we're going to enter information into these different cells without using their specific location like we've been doing so far. So the technique I'm going to use is in our code. I'm going to ask it to select cell A2, so the header of column A, and they're going to write the code that essentially does the same as us using control and the down arrow, down cursor arrow. So we do control down, shoots to the last row in a list. Now you might have used that technique before, And I believe I did on a previous video when we were recording on this course. And we could always record ourselves doing that. But now we're going to try and start writing this stuff. So what I'm going to write is range A2, because that's the range I'm using. And I'm going to write dot end. So one of the properties of the range object is end. I'm going to select that. Open in parentheses. So it asks us for a question. What end? Excel down, left, right or up. The same as your cursor arrows on the keyboard. I'm going to say down, Excel down, closing bracket, dot select. So that line there is the same as what I just demonstrated, where it will shoot to what is currently cell A4, but in reality we would not know, the bottom of that list. Now I need to move one more cell down, because that's not the empty row, that's the bottom of the list. So I'm going to use an object. Whoops, sorry, I'm not going to use range. I'm going to use active cell first of all. Active cell is amazing. It is such a key way of referencing to know. It refers to the cell that the user is currently in. And a lot of times in your procedures you won't know that. The user's got to hit a button at any given point and you want to apply it to the cell they're currently in. But we don't want the cell I'm currently in. I want the cell below where I currently am. So I'm going to use a property of active cell known as offset, which when I put an opening bracket after offset, which is a brilliant way of moving relatively around the worksheet. It'll ask me how many rows and how many columns would I like to move. I'm going to ask it to move one row down, a comma, and 0 columns across. Can we just move one row down? Closing bracket, dot select. So I'm moving one cell below the active cell. Now that I'm in that cell, I can write active cell dot value. It's now looking at putting a value into the cell I'm in. Equals, and their next ID is number 3. And now I'm going to use the active cell to reference the cells to the right of where I am for the expense and the amount. So I'm going to put active cell dot offset 0 rows down, but 1 column to the right, dot value equals train tickets. And if I copy that line, or some of that line, I'll move 2 columns to the right, and I'll put in a value of £20. So we're moving to the bottom of the list, offsetting down 1, and entering this information. Now in this case, I want to click somewhere different on the sheet. And instead of just running the code, I should really comment these others out first as well. I want to step through the code so that we can see this working line by line. This is a fantastic technique for debugging errors in code, for trying to understand how somebody else's or your own code in 6 months' time works. And to do this, we need the F8 key on the keyboard. Now I can also run it by using the debug menu at the top. And I want this step into approach. Let's say the keyboard shortcut is F8. So if I press F8, it will go from the first line at the top, sub-referencing cells, and every time I press F8, it will step an extra line through our code. So I'm on range A2, Excel down, And as I press it, looking on the sheet in the background there, it shoots to cell A4. So it's gone A2, Excel down, and the last row is A4. The last cell is A4. If I press F8 after offset one cell or one row, it moves one cell down, then puts 3 inside there. Then we're going to see it put train ticket in. Notice we don't see the cell move anymore because we're not selecting, we're just referencing it, dot value, and then 20 in the last cell. So now we've got some code that can move relatively to the bottom of a list and input this information. So we're getting one better there. But we're going to change that a little bit more. Now, on a previous video we looked at cleaning up recorded code. I'm now going to look at cleaning up my current code. Before I do that, I should exit what's known as break mode, which I could do actually by pressing F8 one more time, because I'm at the end of this procedure. But probably worth a mention now, I can see that I've got a yellow arrow and a yellow line here, and right at the top of the screen it's got the word break in square brackets. So it's telling me I'm in something called break mode, which some people call debugging mode, because as we see as the course progresses, you generally come in here by hitting a debug button after getting a runtime error. I'm going to hit the blue square on the toolbar, my reset button, to reset that and come out of break mode. And I want to put these 2 lines onto one line. There's no need to select the last row and then select the one below it. I could put that in one line. I could remove this select at the end of the first line there, and take out active cell from the one below it, and in one line I could just say range A2, Excel down, and offset one more off that. So I can get this working in one line now, which is far more effective, much cleaner. Now to be honest, I don't even need to select it, I could write the value in all in one go. But I'm not going to do that. You have to draw the line at some point, and this code needs to be readable. And to offset, a certain number of cells and stuff is just going to be confusing to people. So I'll put us in there, and then I'll use active cell to reference. So if I change this to 4, or in fact, tell you what I'll do, I won't change it to 4, because I don't know the next row, the next ID. Instead of 4, we're going to write that we want to assign active cell dot offset. What I want to do is reference the cell above, which currently has 3, and I'm going to plus 1 on top. So it's going to increment the ID number on its own. So I'm going to put to offset -1, the one row up, comma 0, 0 columns, closing bracket, dot value, and I'm going to plus 1. So that should now look cell above, which is 3, plus 1 to 4, and add that in. So if I click elsewhere, and if I run this code by F8ing through, I can see it move immediately into the next empty cell, A6, add 1 on top to get 4 in there. I've got another train ticket for £20 here. I've forgotten to change that, but that can happen. I do buy a lot of train tickets, unfortunately. Really damages my wallet. And in it goes as we move through. It's now able to go right to the bottom, put it in this next empty row, and increment the ID number. I'm going to press F8 one more time. I don't need to hit the stop to exit break mode there. I can just complete the procedure as it would be. So now we've managed to get a 4th expense in using some other referencing techniques, Excel down, offset, and we've even looked at different techniques for offsetting, a little formula there. Now for the next example, I want to copy that expense sheet onto sheet 2. I've got sheet 2 on here, which currently has nothing on it. And I want to copy the whole of this range, which I don't know how big that range is. I'm just going to comment out our previous code so that I keep it there for reference on this file. Actually, I could have kept that, because what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to create a new sub-procedure. Let's get rid of that locals window. We'll see it later in the course. Alright, copy list. And I'm going to put this in a different sub-procedure. We're going to have a couple of lines of code that are going to copy that whole list and then paste it onto a different sheet. Now, first of all, to copy that whole list, once again, many ways of doing so. I want to take this opportunity to see and use current region. So I'm going to write range A2. Now I've got a variety of choices what range to use here, but I'm picking A2 as arguably the most logical cell to use, being that's the initial heading. It's something I can guarantee is there and I can use, and it's easy to remember. I'm going to put dot. I'm going to use current region, which is your kind of select all approach. It's everything in that list from A2. So as it looks around its boundary, it knows the whole list. Current region dot list of properties and methods. I'm going for copy. I want to copy the whole of that range. So in effect, copy region is the same as us kind of doing a select all from cell A2. Let's select all in here. Am I going mad? Let's do a Control A. Is that full select all was up there? So it's going to select the whole region as it knows it. It's not always going to get it right. You have to be careful with that in your range. But current region dot copy. Now I need to paste it onto sheet 2. Now I could write sheets and reference the sheet by its name. As we can see in our prompt here, I can also reference the sheet by its index number. So it would quite easily work if I just put number 2. Now in this case I want to use sheet 2, pretend that I know it by name. But once again in this course we'll see techniques like this when looping, really, going through all the index numbers, all the sheets. Just going to return to writing sheet 2 and using it by its name. Notice the reference to the sheet used the same syntax as range. That I've got the opening parentheses and the opening speech marks on there. Yes, so as well as sheets, another way you can reference is worksheets. Now there are, it's a very fine difference between worksheets and sheets. In this example, I could use either. The main difference really is that if I reference a worksheet, I'm referencing a worksheet, and sheet 2 is a worksheet. So I'm referencing a sheet, I'm referencing all types of sheets in Excel. And for example, when you create a chart and you move that chart to its own sheet using the move chart functionality, you're getting a chart sheet, which is not a worksheet. So there's a very fine line between whether you're referencing all types of sheet or a worksheet. And in most cases you can probably get away with either. But in this case you can get away with either, but there's a very fine difference, and you need to be aware of the difference between worksheets and sheets. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to reference range A1 on there, the very first cell on that sheet, and I'm going to use paste special. How useful is paste special in Excel? Now I can't use a normal paste here. You don't get a paste on the range object, so I have to use paste special even to do a normal paste, which is all I'm going for here. So I won't put any arguments to it, like paste values only, values and number formatting, paste formulas, and all them awesome options you get with Paste Special. So it's to select that range and paste it onto the other sheet. If I use my F8 to step through here, that will take a copy. I can see the running ants around my range. Next one, paste it onto the other sheet, which I can't really see because I'm on expenses at the moment. I'll finish off that macro and we'll have a look at sheet 2, where I can see we have that data on there. Brilliant. So now we've looked at code for copying and pasting ranges of data. We've also seen references to different sheets and a use of a property known as current region. Okay, now in the final example here of this video, we need to look at copying to a workbook, or referencing a workbook really, but I'm going to use the opportunity to copy to it. Scroll this down, and for this technique, let's remove that. I need to create a new workbook. So I've got a new workbook here called Book 2, and if I move back to my other workbook, reference cells and sheets, and into the editor. So I've got this workbook, and now I've got one called Book 2. I want to copy this range to that book. Now the technique here is that on this range I'm going to select the range. So I want to show the example, which will be extremely common as we go through our macros, that the user has already selected the range of cells. We want to be able to work with whatever that range was. And I don't know if they've selected column A, A2 to A3, or the whole list. But we're going to work with the user selection. So I'm going to write selection. Could that be any easier? Our object called selection, which always has the current selected range. Just like active cell is the cell the user is currently in. It is as easy as that, and that is crazy useful. Now I'm going to put .copy to copy that range of cells. And now I'm going to paste it all in one go. So in a previous macro we didn't select it, we copied the range and a different statement pasted it, which you may find easier to kind of read or to use. But in this example I want to do it all in one go. So I'm going to put a space and I'm going to write one of the arguments that you get with the copy method, which is to specify a destination. And as we saw in the previous video, if I'm writing the name of the argument, I have to put colon equals and then answer it. And I want to answer it by referencing the other workbook, a sheet on it and a cell. So I'm going to write workbooks. So once again, always as a plural. Notice it's worksheets, sheets, workbooks. Technically that's a collection. But we always use a plural. So it's workbooks, open in bracket. I want to specify the name of the book, which I don't need an extension for in this case. You could put .xlsx. And then I'm going to reference a sheet within there. I'm going to use the sheets object. I'm going to reference it as sheet 1. I haven't renamed these, so there must be a sheet 1. Then within there I'm going to reference a range. Oh, I forgot my my full stop there. A range, which I'm going to use A1. So I've got the full kind of object model here. I'm going through a workbook onto the sheet, onto the range. If I click off that, it checks it and sees that it's happy with it. Just got a bit too far off my screen there, haven't I? Here we go. Selection.copy, and the destination is the workbook, the sheet and the range. So if I play that, so click anywhere in the procedure, make sure you're in the right procedure, hit my Run Sub User Form button. Now I had that range selected prior, which to test this is obviously very important. If I find book 2, the data is on sheet 1, A1 of book 2. So now we have copied data to a different workbook and looked at the selection object. So that just about wraps up this video. So, longer than I would hope, but I want to try and cover some of the key ways of referencing cell sheets and books, which we're going to do throughout the course. So we are going to have that stuff ingrained in us. It will just become second nature. But quite a few different techniques there, which are going to stand us in good stead for all the more sexy macros that we're going to get putting together. Hello and welcome to this lesson where we look at some of the different types of error that you may get when working with VBA. Now there are 3 types of error that you can come across, known as syntax errors, runtime errors and logical errors. Now we're going to ignore logical errors for the moment, because them types of errors are when your code runs but it doesn't work correctly. So there's an error in the logic. Maybe your if statement doesn't quite calculate correctly, or your loop's not working. So the only way of solving them is to look at your code, step through it and figure out where the error in the logic is. What we are going to concentrate here is syntax and runtime errors. Now later in the course we're going to look at different techniques for handling these errors, how to recognise and diagnose when the code is running. For now we just want to look at being able to recognise them. And we're going to start off with some syntax errors, which is just when there's an error in your line of code. So, for some reason it doesn't compile correctly, and VBA doesn't like the kind of language that you've used or the grammar that you've used. So for example, just using the code from the previous video, if I was to remove a closing parenthesis off the sheet 2 reference here, and I clicked on a different statement to exit that code, I get this compile error, expected list separator or closing bracket. So there's a classical, we call syntax error, where the error is in the language that you've used, and typically it's a classic typing mistake. Yes, so we can see there it immediately points to the area of code as well. So it's a very good message. It's quite clear probably that we've missed the closing bracket at the end of that sheet 2 reference, and now it's okay. Now you get similar errors in all the classic typos, missing out double inverted commas. If I clicked away to run that, expected list separator or closing bracket. Now this one's not, well, that's the same message, not quite as clear because it took me to the wrong area. So hopefully you'll notice the closing speech marks there. I believe it brings me to this area because that's where the next kind of double inverted commas or speech marks appear. It's slightly deceiving there, not quite as accurate, but the same message and something that you'll get used to seeing. I'm not saying you're as bad at typing as me, but everybody's going to make typing mistakes, especially when you get tired or trying to type something quickly. Now another classic typing mistake is on the plural use of things like workbook and worksheets. Now notice as I click away that it doesn't warn me about this. It's quite happy. Because, oh yeah, worksheets, that's fine. But when I go to my play button to run this code, or my run sub user form button, it then prompts me for it, saying that a sub or function is not defined and has selected it. So some of these errors will appear as you type, and as soon as you exit that statement and go to the next line, for example, it will warn you about it there and then. Some of them, like that one, will appear when you play it. And as I do that, I can see it also goes into what called break mode. this yellow arrow has appeared where it's got sub copy list, and it's asking me to step through the code to figure it out. Now it's also highlighted the area, and I can see it's because it should say worksheets. If I try and play that again, it runs through. Okay, so there are different types of syntax error, and every time we've got one there, we've received this kind of message appear to give us a prompt. Now you can turn that message off. If I went up to my Tools menu and to Options, we can turn off the auto syntax check. So you still get the messages when you hit the run button and try and run your procedure, like on that worksheets example. But examples are missing closing speech marks and closing brackets. You do not get the dialog box, or sorry, the message box. So if I recreate one of those lines again and click away, it still highlights it in red, warns me of the syntax error, but you don't get the message anymore saying, you know, that I've missed a closing parentheses. So I can always put that back in. I might recognise the red errors. Now I'm going to go and turn mine back on. It's quite common for people to turn it off as they don't like the messages popping up. You know, maybe when you're beginning with VBA, it helps you diagnose these errors, but at times they'll start to get irritating. And just like when you use, for example, Microsoft Word, and it notifies you of spelling mistakes, it doesn't prompt you to change it there and then. It just kind of puts its hand up to say that you've made some kind of spelling mistake or typo. You can come back to it at any point, you know, even next week, and deal with it then. Okay, now the other type of error is a runtime error that I wanted to look at. So for this example, I'm going to change the sheet reference to sheet 4. As we only have 2 sheets in this book, don't know if you remember from the previous lesson, but here they are, expenses and sheet 2. There is nothing called sheet 4. So, as I begin to run this, I get a runtime error. So runtime errors have a number associated with them, and we'll look at this later in the course. You can Google and get a list of these different numbers and what they mean. But you get this description anyhow: subscript out of range, so it cannot find sheet 4. Now you get this end and debug options when you get a runtime error. And if I click debug, it will take me into this break mode, as they call it, and it highlights the line that they believe the error is in. Now they're not always going to give you the correct line. They're not always as easy to solve, but hopefully most of the time they'll take you directly to the statement that has the error in, and we can look at working with it. And I know here that it was sheet 2 instead of sheet 4, and I could play that again. Now as I click away, I can see that despite changing it, I'm still in this break mode. If I played this in this example, it will probably be okay, but you might notice yourself getting can't execute code in break mode, if I remember the error correctly. So you cannot run code as a general rule whilst in break mode. So you typically go to this blue square and toolbar, this reset button, to come out of break mode and back into your code, so that if I went to run it now, it would run fine. So this video was just a quick look at 2 errors that you're gonna see as you start writing code, and I didn't want it to put you off as you started to move into the concepts of variables and loops and decision making constructs. So I wanted to get them out of the way. So later on in the course, once we've got more familiar with how to write statements and different types of error that we see, we'll look at better ways of handling them. Or maybe better is the wrong word, but other ways of handling them. But for now, 2 errors. The syntax one especially, I'm sure we'll start seeing. Hello and welcome to this video where we begin to look at using variables in our VBA code. Now when we use Excel in its typical spreadsheet environment, we are using cells to store our data, whether it be currency, date, text, percentage. Now when we write macros, and using VBA to write a procedure, we use variables to store our information. So unless we are looking at writing information to a cell to make it visible to the user, data should be stored in variables, as they ensure that your code runs much faster than storing data in cells, so you don't have to write to the cell and read the cell. A variable is not a physical container like a cell is. It's stored in memory, so it's much faster to access. It's not something that you can see. And there are also different data types, so it provides an area of validation for the data that it stores as well. What I'm going to use as an example here is we're going to look at filling in this invoice. Or we're not going to fill it in, it's already filled in. But we want to store information about this invoice on this invoice tracker sheet. We want this as a new entry at the bottom, similar to some of the stuff we've been doing so far, but the difference here is that I'm going to store the invoice date, invoice, client, and if I scroll down a bit, total, to a variable. Each will have its own variable before we then write it to the sheet. So I want to use an example of using 4 different types of data as well in a variable. So let's get stuck straight in. I'm going to switch to the Visual Basic editor and insert a new module and create a new procedure which I'll call Using Variables. And the first thing we should do is declare our variables. Now, it's not mandatory to declare your variables, but it's extremely good practice. It is highly recommended. It makes your code much easier to read. It also makes it faster as it uses less memory. Let's maximize that. And it also, what's the other thing? It provides an area of validation, so we'll get type mismatch errors, as we're going to specify that one stores a number and one stores text, etc. Just like we can use validation and formatting on a worksheet normally. Now, variables should always be declared as the first thing in a procedure. That is where people expect them to be found. And to declare them, we use the word dim, which stands for dimension, which is not really that important to know, but just in case you felt there was an insult, it is for dimension. Then we follow it with the name of the variable, and for this first one, it's going to be the date of the invoice, so I'm going to call it invoice date. You can't use spaces or start with numbers in variable names, the same rules as using procedure names or macro names. And then I'm going to put the word as to specify a data type for this variable. And probably no surprise that I'm going to specify this as a date. Now, there are many different data types with variables. We're going to look at 4 different types here, and I've provided a sheet for download or just for viewing in this lesson, so you can have a look at that. And it lists, I think, about 15 of the main types of variable, which we're going to see throughout this course. We're going to use Boolean variables and long and object and these different types. But just like there are many types of formatting on the sheet, there are many types of variable. Okay, now the second variable, so I'll use dim to declare, is going to be for the ID. So I'm going to have invoice ID, and that I'm going to store as the data type of long, which can only handle integers, negative and positive integers, of quite a large value. That sheet will also mention data types of byte and integer, which are also used to store numbers, but of less values. And I don't know how many IDs over time we will use, so I'm using a large number to be sure that I don't get an overload error and that it's capable of handling whatever number goes in there. Byte, for example, handles as much as 0 to 255, This is only good for small numbers like people's ages, number of spreadsheets within a book, and integer, which goes as far as I think it's 32,766, I believe. So once again, quite a small number. I mean, much bigger than byte, but considering there's over 1 million rows in a spreadsheet, etc., 32,000 is not that big a number. Okay, next up, we're going to have the name of the client, and that is going to be storing text. So the data type is string. We use data type called string to store text. And finally, we're going to have one to store the invoice total. So we'll call it invoice total, and that is going to be the data type of currency. So I'm taking this opportunity to store 4 different types of data. Now once again, I could declare a variable without the data type. It's not necessary. It's quite happy for me to do that. And although the name kind of gives this one away with dates, though it is recommended both to make your code readable, if it will know what's going on, but also to make it faster. If you do not specify a data type, it uses the data type called variant. Variant is like a chameleon data type. It can handle any type of data in any given situation. So it's extremely useful at times. But I believe it's 16 bytes of data at a minimum. Whereas things like long handle 4 bytes. This is all on that sheet. It's something you can reference in VBA help or on that sheet I've provided. But it's a good, what is that, 8, just 4 times, at least 4 times larger, more space it's taking in memory. Okay, so they are our declarations for variables declared. Next up, we're going to initialize the variables. We're going to assign a value to them, and we want to assign the value from that invoice sheet. So if I just pop back to the invoice sheet for a moment, we can see that the date is in cell D3, number on D4, client D5, and total D27 on a sheet called invoice. Now, probably won't bother putting a button in because we've done that on this course, but I'm imagining that I would put a button around here or something on this invoice, so I know somebody's on the sheet when they run this, so I don't need to reference the invoice sheet in the procedure. I'm going to pop back to our editor, and I'm going to put invoice date equals range D3, if I remember rightly, dot value. So I'm assigning the value from D3 to a variable called invoice date. And then I'm going to do the same for the others. So I have invoice ID equals range D4 dot value. Tell you what, let me take a copy of that. In for the next one, client equals, and I'll paste that in, the value of D5, and finally the invoice total equals the value of D27. So I've assigned the 4 values to a variable. Now you might be thinking you could have just written them straight onto the other sheet. You don't need the variable. And you're right, I don't. So this maybe isn't an award-winning example of the use of variables, but it's just to get us into the concept and get us into the practice of doing them. Trust me, there will be some far more awesome examples of the use of variables before the end of this course. And if you're not appreciating their use as yet, you certainly will. They're a fundamental concept of VBA programming. Okay, next step is to get to the position where we want to input these values, which is at the bottom of the invoice tracker sheet. So I'm going to put worksheets, and I'm going to reference the invoice, or I'm going to activate the invoice tracker sheet. Dot activate shooting through this. This is stuff we've done on previous lessons. Selecting a sheet, and I'm going to select the next empty cell at the bottom of this list. So I'm going to say range A2 dot end Excel down dot offset 1,0 one row below dot select. So there's something we've done on a previous course. One line that's going to get us the next empty cell at the bottom of column A, as that is. And now we're going to write them values in. The first one that needs writing is the ID. If I just quickly refresh our memory, this is the invoice tracker sheet. So ID, date, client, amount. Let's pop back to that. Back to our editor, active cell. Active cell dot value equals, and I can put invoice ID. So the value that's in that variable can now be assigned to a cell. I'm then going to put active cell dot offset 0,1 to move one column to the right. Value equals. Now I want to put invoice date. I'm going to take this opportunity to mention something else. If I hold down Control and press space, that will force this list to appear. So it may help with inputting things like variables. So as I'm typing invoice, I can see my variables now appear in that normal list of properties and methods that we've been seeing so far, and we'll see a lot more of. So it's another way that might speed up the input of your variables. So that was Control and your spacebar to initiate that list. Okay, let me take a copy of this active cell dot offset, and I'll put equals client, and I'll paste it in again to say equals invoice total. And then I'll need to change them offsets to the second column along and the third column along. So now we've written the three variables into the active cell. Now I'm going to put one more thing in. I think I'm going to have a message box that will display the invoice ID to the user. So I'm going to say invoice ID. Let's put a space in there. Now I'm going to concatenate the ID in, which is invoice ID. I referenced a variable that has got the ID stored. So you can see it's much easier to reference the ID rather than having to say sheets, invoice, range, D4.value, which is where it is. It's much shorter code, far easier to reference. Remember, I'm on the invoice tracker sheet at the moment, so I have to reference back to invoice to get to it. Okay, I'm going to then concatenate on another piece of text, to say has been added to the tracker. So a quick little message box, say invoice ID blah has been added to the tracker. Now, one last thing I want to add to this before we play this through is this locals window that I have at the bottom of my screen at the moment. Now, if I close that down, we can bring the locals window in from the view menu. And we'll see some of these other windows by the end of the course. But this is a logical point to talk about locals, as it is used to track your variables. So I choose the locals window, it appears at the bottom of the screen, although you can move it. I love the locals window. I use it an awful lot. I say it tracks your variables as you go through your code. So the plan is to restore this window so we can see what's going on behind it. So we can both see the spreadsheet behind, and I can also see the locals window. And I'm going to use the F8 key to step through the procedure. So as soon as it starts, so you can see the declaration. Type on the far right, current value in here. So the speech marks for the string there, and the name. And as we step through it, I can immediately see the initial assignment there. So it goes past the invoice date, which you can also see by hovering over the variable name in the code. You can see at the bottom that it has the correct date. We can spot an issue if there was one at that point. Continuing to press F8, I can see each bit of information getting stored in the locals window, allow me to track it to identify problems or understand somebody's procedure. Now this one, we'll see it move to the tracker in the background. I'm in row 5 somewhere by the looks of it, but as soon as I move past that, I'm in that empty cell. And then it's just going to write each variable details. Let's move this out of the way for the next one, into the appropriate cell. Bit of a mix up on formatting there. I've got accounting and currency going on. Something to deal with. Finished with a message box. Invoice ID 114, so using the variable, has been added to the tracker. So that is an introduction look at variables. The importance of declaring your variables should happen at the top of a procedure, normally followed by the initializing of the variables, although it can happen at some other point in the procedure, and then looking at writing them to cells and also a message box. The variables can accept data from message boxes, cells, functions, input boxes, user forms, anything we use in VBA, and we will be using it as a way of storing data during a macro so that we can then refer to it and use it. Hello and welcome to this video on the role of option explicit in VBA. Now by default you do not have to declare variables in VBA. So we mentioned in a previous video how important it is and the benefits of them. We're now going to look into this a little bit more, and the fact that by default you do not need to. However, if I was to demonstrate an example here, and within this code I'm going to remove the C from our invoice total here, therefore trying to imitate a typing mistake, and I'm going to use my F8 key to step through the macro. And notice in my locals window, which I still have open at the bottom, that it has created a variable called invoice total. So because our code has come across, our compiler has come across a word which it doesn't recognize as an existing variable or a reserved word in VBA, so it's therefore created a variable by that name, assuming that's what it must be. Now this may seem like good behaviour, I don't know, but this is not good. It makes it very difficult to try and track why your code is not working. And if I just double check that I'm on my invoice sheet, I am, and if I carry on stepping through this code, we will see that it assigns the total to the wrong variable now. So I don't get an error message, it just continues to work but doesn't work correctly. What we sometimes call a logical error. So this can be much more difficult for you to track down and figure out why your code is not working. Especially when we start looking at loops and if statements and these more complex stuff. So it is definitely common practice to declare your variables. And that is what a line called option explicit will force you to do. So if I click my reset button on the toolbar to come out of break mode here and stop that, and I'll put my C back into invoice total, and above and before any other lines of code in the module I will type the words option explicit to force you to explicitly declare your variables. So now, I should have left that out. If I just take that C back out of invoice total, and if I F8 through my code, it immediately gives me this error message saying I have a variable not defined, a compile error, and it has highlighted the word in question. So much easier for me to debug that issue now, as that word must have been typed incorrectly. Now with the words option explicit there, seeing the error message of variable not defined is not unusual, and it's so common that you've just made a typo, so you've missed the N out of range and you've put rage, or you missed a D out of end, and normally just stuff like this, and it'll come up variable not defined. So it may not be a variable, just you have mistyped something, and it's far better than it warns you than it just has a guess at creating a variable in that instance and running with that. Okay, let's stop that debugging and put my C back in, and I've just typed option explicit above and before anything else in this module, and it's sectioned it off for me. Let's have a look at the Tools menu and options from that menu, where we can see that there is a checkbox to require variable declaration. Now this checkbox would not work retrospectively, and it would not put option explicit in this module if it was not already there. What it does ensure though is that with that box checked, if I clicked on OK and went to insert future modules, option explicit would immediately be at the top. So for now and forever, I'll go back to module 1, option explicit will be there. And that is highly recommended that that checkbox becomes checked to ensure tools options, that checkbox there, that option explicit is always there, and you are forced to declare your variables. It is very much good practice. Okay, let's have a look before we come out of here at a couple of other examples of the importance of declaring variables. We spoke about the speed, the ease of reading, that I can see the variables already. I even know what data type they are, and we spoke about this in a previous video. Let's see a couple of more error examples. So what I'm going to do is this invoice ID variable we've got as a data type of long, which handles a huge number, an integer value, negative to positive. Remember on my previous lesson, I have an attachment there, I have a file for you to download or to view within the lesson, which lists the more popular data types. What I'm going to do is change that to byte. Byte being it handles a value between 0 and 255. It's a very small integer. Now the current value on the invoice is 114. So if I was to run that, that should be quite happy with that value. So as it goes through, I can see 114 assigned to that variable as it's the data type of byte. You can see on the end there. Now if I stop that, if I reset that, and on the invoice sheet, I'm going to change that to a number larger than 255. So that if I go back to the editor and I start stepping through my code, I receive a runtime error, number 6 at that point, an overflow error. And if I hit debug, it prompts me to the area. I can see the value has not gone in there. The value is too large for that data type, an overflow error. So without me specifying that as bytes, I would not have seen that or even declaring it. So these are some of the importance, some of the things that are really going to help you out with troubleshooting, reading what's going on and that kind of stuff. I'm going to reset that. It was just a demonstration of an overload runtime error there. I'll change that to long to handle larger values. And for another common error message related to variable declaration is if I go back to the ID and I'm going to type a letter T in front. So maybe an honest mistake. It's 321 here, so it should. Actually, it's two. That would be too much. How's my maths? 211, which should be less than 255. But the letter T in front, indicating that should be text. And I've just made an honest typing mistake. Actually, this is long now, so it should easily be in that anyhow. What am I talking about with them numbers? But if I start to F8 through this, bam, we've got another runtime error. This one caused by the letter T, which means that would be string, that is text. It's trying to assign it to a variable with a long data type, which can only handle whole numbers, negative and positive, type mismatch. So it cannot handle that type of data. And there it prompts me to it. Now, if I didn't have long on the end there, that would be quite happy to handle that, because as I F8 through, I can see my invoice ID has a data type of a variant. So it should be able to handle that value. In goes T211. And I can see the speech marks around it indicating it is stored as a string. It says there, variant currently as a string. So there's some good uses of the variant. And if we were going to use it, I would, type as variant rather than leave it blank, because that makes our code, let's reset that project, makes our code more readable. But, this is stuff that you may come across when you see other people's macros. So it's good to know this stuff, but there is certainly a best practice, and that is certainly to use option explicit, and more importantly than that, to declare your variables with a data type. Hello and welcome to this video on variable scope, where we start to look at the accessibility of your variables across different procedures. So we've got the sub procedure created that we've been using in the last two videos, the last two lessons, where we have sub using variables. And at the moment, the variables that we have declared using the dim keyword at the top of our procedure are only available within this procedure. So only available to statements within this procedure. What we're going to look at doing is I'm going to create a new procedure within this code module, module 1, below this using variables 1. So I'm going to put dim add to invoice tracker. So I've created a new sub procedure called add to invoice tracker, and I'm going to cut and paste the statements that perform the add-in to the invoice tracker. So I'll put the word dim there instead of sub. That have been adding it to the invoice tracker sheet. So I've left the code in using variables that declare the variables and then assign the initial values to them. I've left them there, and I've added the ones that add them to the invoice tracker to this other procedure. Now in the using variables procedure, I will add the line call add to invoice tracker. So that line will run the other procedure, the other macro, or call it from the using variables procedure. So it will declare the variables, assign the values, run the other procedure, which will then add them to the invoice tracker sheet. Now this is good practice to break down a large macro into more manageable chunks. And this isn't a large macro, But the example, the kind of concept is not a bad idea. It's very popular. It's a very good idea to have these more manageable macros. Now I've got my locals window open at the bottom, and I'm just going to double check what sheet I'm in. I'm in the wrong sheet. I need to be in the invoice sheet, where I have this new invoice. And from the editor, I'm going to use my F8 key to step through. So I'm going to click within the using variables procedure and use F8 to step through. I can immediately see the locals window declare those variables. And as I step through, I can see it assign the values to them. And then it jumps to the add to invoice tracker procedure, and I get this message for variable not defined. And if I drag that to the side, I can see it's complaining about invoice ID. I can see at the bottom in the locals window that I do not have any variables. So they have been reset, they have not carried across, and that is the problem. So I'm going to OK that and reset the procedure out of break mode. And to solve this, I'm going to cut and paste them 4 statements that declare variables below option explicit at the top of this module. So by doing that, notice the editor puts this line below the variables to section them off. I've made those variables available to all procedures within this module. So they're available module wide and not procedure wide as they were previously. So now if I click within the using variables procedure and try stepping through the code, looking down below, if I click this plus sign next to module 1, I can see they're now available module wide. They have module scope. I can see them variables have been declared. As I move through, they are assigned the values, and then it calls the other procedure. And if I expand that module 1 again, I can see they are still available. I can see the assignments are in there. And if I restore this window so I can see behind it, we can see as I F8 through, scroll that down, then it moves to the other sheet and then assigns the values to the extra line and displays the message box. So we have made them variables available to all procedures within this one module at the moment, this code module, module 1, by putting them at the top of the module. Okay, let's reset that module, and what I'm going to do is insert another module to this project. So insert a new module, a module 2, and I'm going to cut and paste the add to invoice tracker procedure to this new module. So now they are in different code modules. Now for this to continue to work, in module 1 I will change the dim keyword to the word public, and by making these variables public, they will be available to all to procedures in all macros of this project, which we'll see a demonstration of. It's quite good practice in very large kind of macros to make a module that just holds your procedures, and and call it variables or something, so you know where they are and they kind of have their own module. I've seen that before. It's not a bad idea. But now with these as public, I've got using variables within that module, the others in the other one. Let's look at running this again. I have to make sure I'm in using variables. Start F8ing through. When I expand module 1 now, I can see that they are there and they are assigned the values. Oh, hold on, I'm on the wrong sheet. Let's stop that for a moment. I need to reset my workbook. I can see them values were not correct. Let's go back to invoice. In fact, let's modify the invoice as well. Denham Motors, be 116. Let's change some of this around. Here we go, we've got a new invoice. Let's go back to our code. Okay, let's give that another try. Let's F8 through. If I expand module 1, we can see them in there. This time it should get the right information. There's the date, 116, Denham Motors, and whatever that was, 670. And it's going to call the other procedure. Module 2, let's have a look. No variables. So I expand module 2, it doesn't show any variables. But if I hover over the variable names within the procedure, I can see that they do have those values assigned to them. So as I move through this, and if I restored that to C behind, I can see the values being assigned to the lines and invoice 116 mentioned at the end. So we don't see them in the locals window because it is local. Module 2 doesn't show any variables, but they are available. The public statement ensuring that the variable, like their values are maintained, and we can see that as we kind of hover over the variable names, which is very useful when troubleshooting code and using variables in this manner. So that is variable scope. We can have variables available to a procedure, to a module, or to a project. To make them available to a procedure, we enter them at the top of the procedure. Available to a module, we enter them at the top of the module. Available to a project at the top of the module, but with the keyword of public. Hello and welcome to this lesson where we have a look at object variables. Now these are a special type of variable, these object variables, because as their name implies, they can act as an object. So we can declare variables using data types such as a worksheet, as a workbook, as a chart, as a range. We can then assign sheets or ranges to these variables and have them act as an instance of a range or a book. They will assume all the properties and methods of one, so it can provide us with an easy way of referencing a particular sheet or range, even if we don't know, the address of the range or the name of the sheet ourselves. So as an example of this for now, I'm going to use this invoice tracker macro that we've been working on in this section of the course, and we're going to look at how we could improve it with a couple of object variables. Now we're going to see some amazing examples of these variables later on as the course, as we slowly progress after getting these concepts under a belt into some far more sexy ways of where they can be used. For now though, up where we can declare our variables, I'm going to declare another variable using the same technique that we've used so far, so the keyword of dim, and then I'm going to use the name SHT, and I'm going to specify the data type as a worksheet. So this is an object data type. Now when I press enter, the name worksheet does not go blue like the other data types do. If I'd written the word object, it would have, but I'm being far more specific as I know the type of object I want to use here. I'm going to declare another variable which I'm going to call new entry, and that data type will be as a range. So I've got one object variable that's going to act like a worksheet and another one that's going to act like a range. And what I'd like to do here is, instead of having to reference the invoice tracker worksheet by putting a statement like this and activating it to get onto the sheet, I would initially assign it to the variable SHT, so then whenever I want to reference that sheet, I can simply use the word SHT. Now the new entry range will act as this. So instead of mentioning to go to the bottom of the invoice tracker sheet, I will assign that once to the new entry variable, so then whenever I need to refer to it, I can refer to it as new entry, a meaningful name. What this will also mean for us now is that we don't have to activate and select stuff on the invoice tracker sheet. When somebody clicks the button, from our invoice, it will not need to go to invoice tracker to do it. It can stay on this sheet and just reference the areas by using our object variables. Now, another twist in the towel to try and strengthen the argument for what object variables can do for you is on the invoice tracker sheet, it has been protected. So I can see on the review tab, unprotect sheet is lit up because that sheet is protected. Now, we will not be able to write to it until I have unprotected that sheet, because these cells here are protected. And row 7 will be what I'm going to have to use. So let's go back to invoice and back to our code, and we'll do the assignment. So I've declared two variables in the same way as before. Now we want to assign something to them. And this is where things get a tiny bit different, because we need to use the keyword set. Whenever we assign to an object variable, we have to use the keyword set. Now, this is something different to what we do, as we can see with the variables above. We do not use such a word, we can just assign straight to them. Once the word set is in, it is, as we know, sht equals, and I'm going to put worksheets invoice tracker. I could just copy the line from below and it's in, and I can now remove that because I will not have a need to activate that sheet when this is working. Now let me grab a copy of that while I have that in my mind, and in the line below I will write set new entry equals, and I'll paste that line in and remove it from where it is below. So SHT is the invoice tracker sheet, but an easy name to reference now. New entry is the cell, well, it's the new entry cell. It is the first vacant cell at the bottom of column A on the invoice tracker sheet. Just realising something I've missed out there. It's going to be our SHT to the left of that range. We're not on that sheet before. I need the SHT there. And our first example, I guess, it's very important that we assign that before I do this, of the use of these object variables. I would have to write worksheets invoice tracker before that otherwise. Okay, that sheet is protected. We need to unprotect it before I can do this writing to the cells. So it's going to be sht.unprotect. So SHT is that sheet. I can unprotect it, and below them lines I'm going to protect it again. So it's going to unprotect them, write the lines in, and then protect the sheet again. Now, last thing I believe on here are these active cell lines. I'm not in that cell. Well, I'm probably not in that cell in reality when this happens. So I'm going to change that to new entry. I'm not selecting it anymore. I'm using these object variables. Let's take a copy of new entry and paste that into the other lines. And I believe we are rocking and rolling. Got my message box. Now this is our code with our object variables. Let's restore this window and check out what we've got. So I'm on the invoice sheet at the moment. As I press F8, variables are declared. And I can see SHT and new entry at the bottom with a value of nothing and acting as a worksheet and a range. Now as you move through and start assigning to these, I can see the assignments are made and I have a plus sign next to them. This shows, if I use SHT as an example, all the different information that that variable now has that I could access about it, because it is functioning as a sheet object. Really useful. Protection. Okay, let's move through. Unprotected that sheet. And then we start writing to the cells. Now I can't see this behind because there's no need to activate that sheet anymore. I'm still on invoice. But if I pop back there now, I can see the first two bits of information are in and the sheet is unprotected. Let's move back to our code. Continue through. In it goes. In it goes. Protected. Let's click on that sheet. It has been protected again. Into the message box, and it's over. Let's reset that. So that is, performing the same job as what we've been doing, but it's showcasing use of object variables, which we'll see some very strong examples of, especially with regards to looping, and when we start getting into our more large-scale projects. For now, it's an example of how to use them, how to write them. Remembering to use the keyword set when initializing to these objects.